let's get this show on the road. So, anyways, for anybody that's new, this stream will be me making a video game from start to finish. So, obviously not all in one stream. I guess technically you could probably make a game within 3 hours, but excuse me, it'd probably be kind of difficult. So instead, we're gonna do a little bit each week. But you can go back at any time. Everything is backed up to YouTube. You can go look at previous streams, and then excuse me, work all the way back up to the current stream and catch up and stuff. So anybody that's behind, feel free to go to YouTube, catch up. Last week was stream number 3. We're currently on stream number 4. Last week we worked on a JSON-based save game system. So effectively, excuse me. Effectively, the only thing the save game system can currently do is save after I hit play and Unity decides to do something. Okay. Allows us to save what our music volume and our sound effects volume sliders are set to. So if you see, I'll set this one low and I'll set this one high. I'll hit back. It's still set to that. Even if I stop running the game, I start running the game again. We go back in, see they're set to what they were set to before. So that's what we worked on last time. We also created these sliders as well as this back button. We created this reset all data button. It doesn't actually do anything yet. Excuse me. So yeah, we'll definitely have to hook that button up today. And then also today what I want to do is I want to work on the level selection menu or the select game menu. So here when you hit play game, also the back button's not hooked up either. So kind of a quick rundown as well for anybody that is completely lost and stuff. Pretty much we've decided that the game itself is going to be a puzzle game. It's going to have to do with cubes, specifically cubes changing color. And then you're going to have these guide cubes here down at the bottom. So these guide cubes are going to show some pattern. So maybe red, green, blue. And the goal is going to be to make your input cubes match the guide cubes. So that's going to be quote unquote solving the puzzle. So each puzzle is going to be the difficulty is going to scale as you go through. I think roughly there's going to be about 100 puzzles right now. And the input cubes, they're going to change color in some predetermined way. So there's going to be some type of rules as you go through to make it more difficult and easier. Because obviously if you just clicked on them and they change colors and you just had to match the bottom, that's not very hard. So some of the ideas are as you go, let's say every time you start activating a cube, any cube that's already been activated, so already changed color at least once, would also change. That's one idea. Another idea we had, one other idea we had was anytime you changed a cube, any adjacent cube would also change color. We also threw some other crazy ideas, like you might be able to lock one cube at any given time, so you can change 3, but one of them would be locked. So on and so forth. So there's a couple different ideas around kind of how the puzzles are going to work, but nothing has really been decided yet on that. That's still open at this point. We've really been kind of focusing on project architecture. We've been focusing on things like the save game system that we talked about last time. Kind of the underlying core features that you need in order to make a game in general, like how to set up a Unity project, how to set up, your Visual Studio, what kind of things do you need to think about when you're designing kind of the core mechanic or something along those lines. So those are the kind of things that we've been focusing on. And then we started now, like once we started actually working on things, so we did a little bit of app initialization, a couple editor tools, and then kind of where we left off was working on this main menu. So, excuse me. Currently in the main menu, you have a quit button that doesn't do anything in the editor. On device, it would actually quit the application. We had the options, which I showed before, which is your music and your sound effects slider. And then we have the play game, which is going to be how you actually get into a game and select what puzzle you want to work on. So let's kind of pick up where we left off then. So one of the things that we did previously was we made our application loading, so our app initialization scene. We we kind of faked it right away. We wanted to make it take 3 seconds, just so that way every time we hit play, we knew like we were in that scene. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and take out that 3 second wait, or at least minimize it, maybe down to 1 second. Just because while developing, even though it's good to know, hey, my scene flow is actually what it should be, it's kind of annoying to constantly be stuck at that screen for 3 seconds every time we want to hit play in the editor. So instead, excuse me. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into that code. Let's see here. Let's go code main. And we're going to figure out where, I'm trying to remember where that was at, that 3 second wait. Was that an application manager? No. Was it in save game manager maybe? Yeah, so here's our 3 second wait that I was talking about that effectively forces you to be on that screen for 3 seconds for no reason. So we're just going to go ahead and we're just going to switch that to 1 second. That way we don't have to deal with every time we hit play sitting on the screen for 3 seconds for no reason. That's just going to make development a little bit faster. So let's see. So yeah, so now we're only on that screen for a second, which is nice. So anyways, so let's go back into our main menu here and let's focus on the options menu real quick. So let's go back into options. Turn off main menu. Okay, so so kind of where we left off last stream was we just created this reset all data button. Okay, we haven't hooked it up, we didn't do anything. We started talking about what it's going to do. So effectively, reset all data is just going to clear your save game. So any configs, any game data that you have saved, any achievements, anything like that, excuse me, it's just going to reset completely. So so what we're going to do is we're going to start actually making that happen. So remember how I talked before, our music and volume, I showed setting those and how it saves and stuff. I can also go to let's see here. I can actually go on disk and show you guys where that's being saved as well. Let's see here. We want to open that in WordPad. So this is our save game file. So every time we save the game, right now we're only saving our music volume and our sound effects volume. And it's this huge float number because we're saving as a float in JSON. Apparently doesn't do any truncating, so makes it quite big. But anyway, so what we want to do is we want to this reset all data button to effectively reset anything that we currently have inside of our save game back to 0. So what's nice is if we open up our save game manager and we go to our actual save game object, we'll see here that there's already defaults built in. So as long as we maintain these numbers being as what we want the defaults to be, then all we need to do inside of our reset save game data or reset all data or whatever we call that, reset all data, when this button is pressed, all we actually have to do is we just have to say, okay, create a new save game object. And when we create that new save game object, it's just going to use the values that's in this system object here. So create a new save game object, set the values to the values that they're set here, in aka the default constructor pretty much, and then go ahead and save that to disk. So effectively what that's going to do is it's going to reset all your data back to the default, which is what we want to happen when you hit that button. So let's go ahead and start hooking up that button. So inside our options menu, if you remember, each one of our screens or our pages, excuse me, so we have main menu, select game, and options. Each one of these has its own code that kind of handles that screen. So so we have, so let's see here. So we have three things in here. We'll go to our options since that's the screen that we're currently on, and we need to add a new variable here for our reset all data button. So we're going to add a new button. We're going to call this reset all data button. Boom. And then we need to create a callback for this. So let's go down our callbacks, create a new callback. Let's call this private void on reset all data button. Okay. And we'll fill in that here in a second. And then we also need to subscribe to that. So let's see here. Reset all data button. On click. So when the button is clicked, we want it to call. We want it to call our on reset all data button method. Oh, we don't need parentheses. Boom. Okay. So yeah. So the cool thing about this is when this button is clicked, what's going to happen is this code in here is going to run. So remember what we want to do, and I'm going to write this down in comments first, and then we'll go in and fill the code in later. But what we need to do is we need to create a new save game object. Okay. Create a new save game object that has all its variables set to default. Ooh, if I can spell default. Then we want to save this new save object to disk, overwriting. Is it really an overwriting? Okay, let's say replacing the current save game file. Cool. So yeah, so that's effectively what we need to do inside this method. So first we're going to go to Unity and we're just going to hook up our reset all data button. So as you know, anytime we add anything, any member variable that can be serialized, so either a public variable that's automatically serialized or a private variable that we mark with this attribute serialized field, as soon as we add that, it's automatically going to add here over here in the inspector a field for that button. So we're going to drag our button over here, hit save, cool. And then, so what's going to happen is when we hit play, as soon as this screen is loaded, the start method is going to be called. So we're going to, remember, we're going to subscribe to our button. Our button is then going to be called, and then we're going to get down here. So now we got to actually fill this stuff in, and I'm going to go grab myself a cough drop real quick. I will be right back. Oh. I'm straight dying. Cough drops are me friend. Alrighty. Cough drops and Gatorade. Only thing that's been getting me through this cold. Okay, so now that we're in our on reset all data button here, we need to effectively do the things that we already commented. So we need to create a new save game object, and we need to save that to disk, overwriting the one that's currently there. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new save game object. So if you remember, in our save game manager, we have a save game object. So we're going to create a new one of them. We're going to call this, we can just call this save game. And then we're going to create a new one. So remember, this is just going to effectively set everything inside of here to whatever we have set here. So our music volume and our sound effects volume are both going to be set to 0.75 or 75% of the volume that it could be. So we're going to create that, and then then we're going to go ahead and save that. So we just need to go save game manager .sinstance .save game. So boom. But let's go and look. I'm trying to remember what exactly this save game does. I believe it saves. Yeah, so it saves this currently loaded save game. Now, currently loaded save game, if we go up to its definition, go to definition, only has a getter. So we can't actually set that explicitly. So maybe what we should do is we should add, probably want to add a helper method in here that allows us to save a new game or restore from defaults or something like that. Mainly because we don't want people to have access, like an options menu. We don't really want the options menu to have access to be able to just go and say, oh, here's a brand new save game file. Just ignore what's currently on disk. we want to be more explicit about it. The reason that's nice is when it comes back to debugging and stuff, you know that we're not completely wiping the save game anywhere else other than this one method in Save Game Manager. If we have that saved, then let's say people start leaving reviews on the App Store, and their reviews are, "Oh, my save game it has been wiped. I lost all my saves. All my achievements are gone," or something like that. It makes it a lot easier to debug that problem, because instead of having to look in like 20 different files where you're completely resaving the game and stuff like that, you can track everything down to one method that is being called. So what we're going to do is we're going to go in Save Game Manager. We're going to add a new public method here. So we're going to go public void, and we're going to call this reset game. So effectively, this is going to do the same thing that we were going to already do inside of UI options, but instead of doing it inside UI options, and then let's say we have to do it in another menu down the road, instead of duplicating that, we can then instead just call that common method in Save Game Manager. So this is both cleaner and safer and probably easier to debug down the road. So let's go ahead and let's copy this here. And then we also want to take this new save game. So what we actually want to do is we just want to set, Visual Studio doing some funky stuff. So we just want to set our currently loaded save game. We're going to save that to a brand new save game object. So effectively what we're doing here is we're resetting the currently excuse me, loaded save to a brand to all default values. Okay, so once we do that, the file on disk, so this file that I was showing before, can I make this bigger? Ooh, I can make this bigger. Nice. Oh, that's a swing and a miss. I did not want to do that. That's what I want to do. So our save game file here, so our JSON file, when we do this, when we set our currently loaded save game to a new one, that's only changing the one in memory. That's not changing the one on disk. So what we need to do then, after we change the one in memory, is we need to then save it to disk. So that's what new save game to disk. So that's what we're doing here in our save game method. So what's nice is now that we're inside of the Save Game Manager, we don't actually have to use the instance anymore. We can just call save game. So reset game now is very simple. We reset the currently loaded save game, which is of type save game object. Okay, so we reset that to its default values by just calling the default constructor, and then we write it to disk. So pretty freaking simple. So let's go back to our UI options. So now on our reset all data button, so when we hit that button, we just need to call into Save Game Manager, and we need to call reset game. Boom. Super simple. So now it's time to go back to Unity and see if this is actually working. So what we want to do is we want to make sure our defaults are set up correctly. So our main menu is showing. All right, we're going to hit play. So notice too, we have some nice debug outputs that we've created in some of the previous streams. So this is for our editor tool, this subscribing to play mode state change. We can ignore that one for now. But this one's relevant. So this is showing us that we're loading file at this path, okay, which is this file right here that I've already opened. So again, remember, things are saved to, was that 53% and 49%. So let's go into options. Let's reset all data, okay. So in theory, what has happened at this point is these have been reset. Let me close this, and then let me actually, I'm going to go back to that file on disk here. What I'm actually going to do is, instead of just opening the file, I'm going to go to the directory so that way we can keep opening it easier. Really, I need to just say, do this. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Can I? Okay, thank you. Me trying to navigate a computer. So anyways, so notice now that we hit the reset all data button, our sound effects volume and our music volume have been reset to its default values, okay? So there's a couple things that I just noticed that aren't working correctly here. Number one, our sliders still are not showing what our reset data was. They're showing what was the save game data when we loaded this screen. Because remember, we only set what these sliders are set to in this initialize sliders method, which is called on start. So what we need to do is when we hit our reset all data button, we need to actually then also update our sliders to the defaults. So if you notice, we go back and go back. Wow, they also did. So yeah, they're still not reset to their value, which is weird. I figured initialize sliders would be called again. Should I initialize sliders? Currently loaded save game. All right, let's go back to Save Game Manager. I'm trying to make sure I understand this problem correctly before I do this. So yeah, so we're definitely loading a new save game here, and then we're saving it. So what happens in save game? So yeah, we just write it to disk. Nothing fancy. So yeah, we just convert our object to a JSON string and then write it to disk. So what's kind of weird here is I would imagine that our initialize sliders method. So I'm actually going to I'm going to attach to Unity real quick. So so anybody that's not used Visual Studio and Unity before, attaching, so being able to debug like your code, hit breakpoints, you know, expose variables, blah blah blah. It's really simple. You just hit attach to Unity up here, which is where the normal like run button normally is, and then at that point you can just go back into Unity, and then when your code hits the breakpoint, really? Okay. Oh, okay. All right, I think I see what's going on. So start, which is on my menu here. Oh yeah. So start is only being called the first time that we turn the object on. So makes sense, duh. So what I think I'm actually going to do is I think I'm actually going to change this. Am I going to change this? I'm debating whether I want to change this or not, because there's a couple different ways to solve this problem. So number one, I can solve this problem by changing on reset all data button to also call initialize sliders after we reset the game. So we could call I need to stop debugging. So I could call initialize sliders here, and if I call initialize sliders here, in theory, when I hit reset all data, so they're already set to 75, 75, so let's set them to something else, and we go back, and we go back in, see they're still set to this. Yeah, so when I hit reset all data, they get set back to 75, 75. Because I'm forcing it, when I hit reset all data, I'm forcing the initialize sliders to run. So something that should be noted here is that our start method, so that's only being called the first time we turn on our code here, our UI options code. So something I'm considering at this point is changing, and instead of doing a start, possibly instead of doing a start, doing on enable and on disable. So what that'll do is every time we switch screens, then this code will be ran, which isn't as important for maybe like where we were at before this. But now that we're doing things more in a way where every time we leave the screen and come back, we kind of want that initialization to happen again, such as like loading the current save game music volume and sound effects volume from disk. I think I'm going to actually go ahead and change that. So let's go, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go on enable. So since on enable is going to be called every single time we open the options menu here in our main menu, something that's important about this is that means we're going to be subscribing to those buttons every single time we hit on enable. Now, if we do that, what's going to end up happening is we're going to end up subscribing multiple times if we keep going back out of that screen and back into that screen. So what's going to end up happening is every time we click the button or change a value, our code is going to be called more than once. Like if we went to the screen 3 times, that means it's going to be called 3 times. So what we want to do then is we effectively want to create also a private void on disable. Oh, maybe if I can spell disable. And what onDisable is going to do is every time we then turn the screen off, so we transition away from the screen, then we're also going to get this code to call. So what we want to do here, excuse me, is effectively we want to unregister callbacks. Whoa, words, spelling, hard. So effectively what we want to do is anything that we registered in our onEnable, we also want to unregister for at this point. What's nice about this as well is if some weird thing happens where our code is not running, but somehow that button is still active and that button still gets a click event, like we don't have to worry about anything inside of our UI options code running if that game object is turned off. So if the options menu is closed, now we know for sure nothing is going to be called in this code. So what we need to do now at this point is we just need to change this to remove listener. So we're just going to go ahead and do a blanket change here. Boom. Cool. And what's nice about this is this just forces, every time we go to the screen now, it forces it to reinitialize, which is good because it's predictability. We know that every time we open this screen, effectively we're going to subscribe to our events and initialize sliders is going to be called, okay? Which is going to grab the currently loaded save game and set our sliders to what they should be set to. So what's nice about this is that means, so let's show an example here. So let's say I killed this initialize sliders here, even though we're probably going to leave that there in the long run. And I went and changed our sliders to, you know, whatever, be some crazy thing, hit back. Okay, so we go back in. Now, I hit reset all data. So remember the problem that we were having before is when I hit that, without having this initialize sliders here, what was happening was that we were setting it to 7575. Like if I go to the save game file, you can see, well, actually I'll reload it because that's the old version of it. But you can see, yeah, it's set to 7575, okay? But our sliders haven't updated. Now, if we go back though and go back into options, now you see they do update. And that's because every time we back out of this menu and go back in, our initialization code is being ran again, which is good. That's what we want in this case. So let's go ahead and let's add back in here our initialized sliders. And then let's put a little comment here where we say, make sure our sliders match what is saved to disk. Cool. So yeah, so that kind of ties off that a little bit. But one of the things that I talked about last week, which I think is important, and this is just around like kind of like UX, so user experience and stuff, is anytime you're doing a very destructive operation, such as resetting all of the game data, you don't just want to do that lightheartedly. You don't want to give people a button and just have them hit it, and then all of a sudden, like, they hit it, and it's just boom, everything's gone. So instead, what we're gonna do is I want to have a pop-up menu. So effectively, I want something that can pop up and say, "Hey, are you sure that you want to reset all your data? This is what it's going to do." Give some type of warning. And then at that point, allow the user to say, "Yeah, I definitely want to do this," or "No, that's not what I thought I was going to do, so no." So we could just really simply create some type of pop-up menu that lived inside of UI options. So let's just do something while the game's running. So remember, this isn't going to be saved. But what's nice about this is I can just create something really quick to show you, and then we can kind of, you know, just let it go to the wayside afterwards. So let's create an image real quick. So let's say we had. Oh, actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make this fill the whole screen. I'm going to use this. I'm going to set this black. I'm going to make it like 50% gray. And then I'm going to create another image. Let's throw that inside of there. And then we're going to put that 0, 0. Make this, I don't know, 500. Whoa, that's not as big as I thought it would be. 1,000, about 1,000. That's still tiny. All right, let's see. How big do I want this? That looks about right. Okay, so then we'll throw some text on here. Be like, "Are you sure?" Throw that in there. It's our text to fill. Sorry, I'm working. Just just kind of going fast at this moment just because it's kind of tempting. And then, so here you could have a UI button. No. 2 buttons. All right, let's make both these buttons a little bit bigger. Whatever. It's really like generic, but this is just for me to prove a point real quick. Alright, so yes, no. Now let's grab both his text, make these texts a little bit bigger so we can actually see them. Okay, so we could very easily just make a pop-up like this, or like whatever you want to say, a game object, a hierarchy, whatever, a UI element in here, and then when we hit this reset all data, we could just very easily turn that on, say, are you sure? And then just allow the user, to select yes or no. Okay, we could do that. That's super simple. That would just live under our UI options. It would be there. Everything would be great. We could even like make the text already say what we want. Like the text, instead of saying, are you sure, could already say like, are you sure you want to delete your data? Sure. Okay. We could have it say like all of that if we wanted. And we could just store that in the scene file underneath UI options. Everything could be fine. But the issue with that is something like a pop-up that says yes or no. Okay. That's something that almost every single game is going to use more than once throughout your game. Like having pop-ups or modals or whatever you want to call them, that's a very common UI element that you're probably going to use a lot throughout your game. So what's really dumb is to force yourself as like a developer, especially when you only have one person, to go through and make a new pop-up every single time throughout the game you want to use a new pop-up. It doesn't make any sense. So instead, what's a much smarter thing to do, in my opinion, is instead of doing that, create some type of dynamic pop-up system or dynamic modal system or whatever you want to call it, that effectively allows you to say, oh, okay, I want a pop-up that has 2 buttons. These are what the buttons are going to say. This is what the text is going to say. And here's a callback for each of the buttons, if that makes sense. So instead of just taking the cheap route and just, making this right here, instead, let's go ahead and create that system that you could use throughout your app. So, so what we're going to do is we're going to go anywhere at this point. Doesn't really matter. We can just create it inside our UI options menu here, and then effectively what we're going to do is we're going to create a combination of code and Unity Prefab. So if you're not sure what a Unity Prefab is, a Unity Prefab is effectively a subset of a hierarchy, okay? So such as our UI options here, that is stored to disk as a YAML file that Unity can then later load at any time dynamically and then spawn or instantiate into the game. So effectively it allows you to kind of take something you already have created, make a template out of it, and then use that later, if that makes sense. But you'll see like exactly here, because that's what we're going to do. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to create that pop-up that we just had there before, but we're going to try to create it in a way that's somewhat generic. So so what we're going to do is we're going to go UI, actually we're going to create an empty child. So this is going to be like the root of our pop-up. So we're going to call this root pop-up. Actually, let's just call it, let's say pop-up, and then this is going to be a 2-button pop-up. So we're going to go pop-up button. I'm trying to think what to call this. We're just going to call this our generic pop-up. Screw it. Pop-up generic. Yay. And then we're actually going to throw that here. So pop-up generic. So effectively, we just want to create a generic 2-button. Good evening, Kurt999. So anyways, we just want to create, hopefully you're having a good one. So effectively what we want to do is we just want to create a generic pop-up that we can use across the app a bunch of different places. It's going to have 2 buttons, a yes and a no. Or, well, it's going to have 2 buttons. You can say what you want to do. So we're just going to go ahead and we're going to start creating that from a UI perspective. So we need an image. We're going to call this background. Background. Okay, I'm going to go background just because I don't like typing as much, even though I type like 3 times as much debating on this. So yeah, so we're going to make this generic pop-up, fill the whole screen, and then this background is going to serve 2 purposes. So number 1, it's going to provide a way to let people know, hey, there's a pop-up on the screen. You need to focus on the pop-up. So, so let's make this stretch and then fill the whole screen. And then we're going to make this black. And then we're going to set the opacity to about 50%. So what this is going to do is it's going to like effectively mask out anything that's on the screen, because we're always going to be putting our pop-ups on, oh, hit my head, there we go. We're always going to be putting our pop-ups in front of everything else. So, so our pop-up's going to go like on top of everything. And in Unity, if you're not familiar with how that works in their UI system, is effectively it's like whatever's the lowest in the hierarchy is on the top, if that makes sense. So like our pop-up generic goes on top of our other UI. So if I drag this, you'll notice if I put it behind our UI options, it goes behind all those options. If I put it, well, I can't put it behind the camera, but effectively you can see, like, look at the slider, which is part of our UI options here. If I throw it behind, ooh, that's not what I want. If I throw it behind it, then now it's behind those things. So whatever the hierarchical order is determines kind of the sort order of the UI. So we want our pop-up generic to always be on top of everything. So we're always going to spawn that in a way that it's like the last child in the hierarchy. But anyways, so there's 2 purposes of this pop-up, or sorry, of the background in our pop-up. Number 1, it masks everything out and focuses on the content of the pop-up. So that's great. Number 2, and more important from a technical standpoint, is in Unity, if we set our image as raycast target here, okay, which is a checkbox. So all Unity hit detection for tapping or clicking or anything like that is in their UI system is done through raycast, okay? So raycast is effectively like an imaginary line that's being drawn from where you're clicking, and it's reporting back what it's hitting, okay? You can do different type of raycast. You can do raycasts that tunnel through everything and report everything that it hits all the way until you tell it to stop. Or the more common is it'll stop on the first thing it hits and return it back. So that's how the Unity UI system raycast works. So what's nice about that is we can set this image as a raycast target. And since it's being drawn in front of our UI options and any other options that would be in our main menu, what's nice about that is that it blocks these other buttons from being pressed. So while our pop-up is up, you can't hit the back button, you can't hit the mute, you can't change the sliders, can't hit resettle data, blah, blah, blah. So what's really, yeah, the really nice thing about that is it allows you to control what the user's clicking on, which is important. Otherwise, people are going to accidentally click on stuff and things are going to happen weird and you're not going to know what's going on. So anyway, so back in our pop-up generic, we have our background. So I kind of explained the different purposes of that. And then we also want to create some other stuff. So we need another image. So this image is going to be effectively our frame. So the frame of our pop-up. So image frame. So for now, again, we're just going to keep things super duper simple because we're a pretty simple app and we don't need things to be crazy. So we want this to just kind of fill roughly the whole screen. But we want it to be, I don't know, I want it to be squared. So let's do 1800 by 1800. And then, yeah, let's just center it in the screen, 0, 0. Okay, cool. So this is going to be our frame. So let's pick I don't know, some color for it. I don't know what color we're not using. Let's go with like a blue or something. Maybe like a, I don't know, like a light color blue. That blue looks kind of cool. Kind of like that. It could be red too, because it's like an alert. Maybe like an orange. That way it's kind of like in between. spend way too much time focusing on stupid stuff like this. Look at the app. The app's got like some crazy colors going on. We got like this puke green. We got some weird purple. We got like an orange pop-up. But hey, it's fine. We're all going to replace this later. This is just so that way we can get some feeling of how it's going to work and really focus on the functionality and make sure the functionality is working correctly. So, excuse me. So anyways, so now we have our frame. So now we need to start kind of populating some elements in here. So we're going to need text. Okay. And let's say we're going to have 2 texts. So we're going to have the title, which can be an optional title that you can put on it. And then we can do actual like content. So the title, let's throw, oh my god, it's tiny. It has a tiny title. So let's put this up here. Let's have it stretch. Okay, and then let's have it I would say it always takes up, how big's our image? 1800? I think it was 1800. So let's go 1500 up. So that way it takes up, I don't know, roughly about 10%, 10 to 15%, something like that, of our top. And let's just call this bad boy. Oh, let's see here. Title. My awesome. So Shift T is my key command. Oh, it only works sometimes apparently. Is my key command for EVGA precision to show me the statistics for my graphics card. As you can see, it was running at 39 degrees Celsius. So yeah, so that's why when I hit Shift T, I'm getting some sweet stuff going on up there. So let's make our text white. Let's throw the font size up a little bit. Yay, there we go. Cool. So let's go with like a font of like 100. What was that? 125. 125 looks good. Cool. So yeah, so this is just where the title is going to go whenever we pop one of these pop-ups up. So the content is effectively going to be the rest of the screen. Oh gosh, it's real tiny. Oh no, swing and a miss. So we want to make... I don't know what I did. Control Z. Oh, I broke something. So Unity is not great. I'm going to be completely honest. Unity is not great at undoing things that you may have done. So I definitely clicked something somewhere. Okay, so that's fine. Background's fine. Frame is fine. Oh, okay. That was weird. So Unity was like, "Hey, we're just not gonna update anything for a while, not until you start like moving things." Okay, so let's go back and do that over again. So title. Unity is definitely not without bugs. That is a fact. So let's go. What do we have? 125, I think set before. Looks good. Okay, let's go a little bit smaller so that all fits. 115, cool. All right, so now let's go back to our content, which is tiny. So we're gonna make much larger. Throw this up here. Use some cool snapping features. Remember? Yay, it's time for me to copy paste. Well, that's not what I want. So what's nice about doing this is it just kind of allows you to figure out what the size of your text you want it to be. So I want all this roughly to fit. So let's go with like, yeah, let's say 85. That looks good. Okay, so effectively now we have all the text that we're going to need. So we're going to need our title, and then we're going to need the content of this pop-up, and then let's go with some buttons. So we need to create 2 buttons here. So one is going to be our let's try to keep it a little more generic. So maybe it's not always a yes and a no. Possibly it can be something else. So we're just going to go button 0, button 1. And then let's take these buttons. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to throw these buttons in a layout group. And what's nice about that is it's going to allow us to effectively say, hey, we only want one button, we only want 2 buttons, and then go from there and have the layout automatically update itself. So let's do empty child, throw it here, throw buttons inside of here. Let's call this our, let's do a layout. Oh, layout was already what I was looking at. Nice. So we want a horizontal layout group here. Oh, nope, that's not what I wanted. Auto course filter. That is not what I want. There we go. Horizontal layout group. And then we're going to make our group fill this area below our content. Okay. And then we want the layout group to determine the size of these buttons. Cool. And then we want it to be middle center. So the reason we want it to be middle center is because what's nice is, so our buttons are, well, let me fudge with the text here because it's tiny. So what's nice about having it set to middle center is that when we get rid of one of our buttons, so let's say this button goes away, now our new button is just going to fill the whole screen. If I was doing something other than middle center, we could get in a scenario where, so let's say we were doing it like this. And then, so again, if I take one of these buttons off, the button is in the center of the screen, okay? But if I didn't have it set to middle center, such as upper left, and I turn one of these buttons off, I believe, yeah, so our button is going to stay on the left. So just to make our layout group work, kind of do some of the heavy lifting for us. That way we don't have to worry about the positions of these buttons or anything like that. We're just going to set this to middle center, and then I'm also going to have the... I'm going to allow the buttons to control their own size, mainly just because I want to set these buttons up in a certain size and then have them stay that size. So we're going to go with, let's see, let's go 800 by 400. Okay. No, let's maybe go 850. Yeah, 850, 400, that looks good. So yeah, so what we're going to do here is we're going to dynamically throw some code on here, and then when we say, hey, pop the pop-up up, we're going to tell the pop-up, hey, we want you to have one button and it needs to say this, or we want you to have 2 buttons and it's going to say this. So what's nice is if we say, okay, we want you to have 1 button, now the pop-up looks like this, which looks a little bit better versus if the button was over to the left. And if we have 2 buttons, we just say, okay, set it up like this, and then now we have 2 buttons that are set up like this. So that's good. That's going to make things a lot easier when it comes to setting these pop-ups up. So let's call this our button layout group. Layouts, buttons. Cool. So yeah, so now we get into the scenario, or the situation I was talking about before with being able to utilize Unity's prefab system to really help us out here. So inside of resources, we're going to create a new folder. I'm going to call this Popups. So again, kind of if anybody's unfamiliar with Unity, so resources is a directory that inside Unity, any resources directory you have. So this could be a subdirectory of something else. You could have multiple resource directory, doesn't matter. Excuse me. Any directory in Unity that is named resources is going to allow you to dynamically load Unity assets from those directories. Effectively what Unity does at build time is it builds anything that's in resources folders throughout the entire project. It builds that into one or possibly multiple, depending how large it is, resource packages that it packages with the executable or with the build, and then allows you to have access to at runtime. So what's nice about that is, let's say we had 500 different pop-ups, prefabs that we wanted to show. You don't want to load all 500 of those pop-ups into memory at the beginning of the app and then just show them and hide them like throughout your going. That wouldn't make any sense. Instead, you want to dynamically load them so that way only the things that you currently need are loaded into memory at any given time. So by using the resources directory and by dynamically loading these things, it allows us to have a little bit more control over like what's loaded into memory at any given time. Now, you can go one step further than that. So we're just focused on a pretty simple Unity project. So that's why we're just going to use the resources directory. It's an easy way to do it. Now, you can go a step further and use Unity's asset bundle system. So what Unity's asset bundle system allows you to do is it allows you to effectively build an asset bundle, which is, I mean, it's just a glorified zip file for the most part. And allows you to take that and then put it anywhere you want. It doesn't have to be packaged with the build like the resources directory files do. So it allows you to put this anywhere you want and then later load that at runtime and then pull assets out of them. So that's really good if you're doing something where you need to download stuff from the web, like a content server, like Amazon S3 or something like that. If you needed to dynamically fetch like assets, like let's say your game had 100 levels, excuse me, but you only wanted to have the first 10 levels on the device, and then the next 90 levels, each user downloaded as like a content pack or something like that. So using Unity asset bundles would allow you to achieve that pretty easily. But for the scope of this project, we don't need asset bundles, so we're just going to focus on just using the resources directory. So anyways, so like I said before, our pop-up generic. So what we want to do is we want to create a prefab out of this that we can then later load at runtime. So we can just go ahead and drag this. Anytime you drag anything from your hierarchy down to your project, it will automatically create a prefab for you. So what's nice is you'll notice anything that we had set inside of here, so such as what our values for our rect transform is, those will be duplicated down in the prefab. And then the same thing, so even though it only shows one layer deep in the hierarchy in the prefab, inside of the actual YAML file, the thing serialized to disk, it's saving all of the children all the way down to the bottom. It's just in the preview window, it only gives you access to preview the first two layers. So what's cool about this is, let's say we had, let's say we had 3 of these pop-ups, okay, loaded in our game. So this is one kind of use for a prefab, okay? What's nice about this is if you make a change in the prefab, it's going to propagate itself all the way up into the let's see here, the runtime instances of that prefab. So if I go to the prefab and I say, oh, let's make everything pink. As you notice, it makes the background, even though I'm changing what's in the project, it makes what's in the game also turn pink. So that's one cool feature of prefabs there. Another good feature of prefab is it allows you to load it at runtime, which is what we're going to do next here. So once we start creating our pop-up manager, we're just making managers all over the place. I don't know if you guys remember me saying in the last stream or previous stream that I work with a guy currently at my day job who hates the word manager, and he's like, you should never call any code manager or controller or anything like that. So to kind of just in spite of him is why I decided to just start calling everything in this app a manager. So so let's go ahead and let's take our pop-up. Let's kind of restore our main scene, or our main menu scene, or our menu scene. I guess it's not a main menu. Back to where it was. Cool. Save that. And then let's go back to our main scene. Okay. So remember how we were setting up our managers currently. So a manager is anything that's going to be running all the time, if that makes sense. So it's something that code needs to be accessible from every screen in the app, or every scene in the app, every game, every level, everything. Things that are persistent across the entire app runs. So effectively in our main scene, when our app initializes, is when we're creating or setting up this code, and then that code then persists as you go through. So what we want to do is we effectively just want to create another one here. So we're going to create empty child, and then, or empty object, we're going to go code, and we're going to call this our pop-up manager. And then we're going to create some code here that is going to, I don't know why I did pop-up with a capital U, and I haven't been doing that anywhere else. Pop-up is one word today. Yay! Excuse me. So let's go into our code, and let's find, what's this, our global managers? Yeah, that's what we're calling it. So what we're going to do is we're going to create another piece of code here, and we're going to call this Popup Manager. And in the same vein as our other quote-unquote global managers, we're going to use the base class that we created before, this global manager base class. So a global manager. And let's go into that and remember and figure out what exactly that does in there. Oh, whoa. What did I? Oh, huh. So here's a true story. So I originally came up developing almost exclusively on Macs. I didn't actually start using Windows for game development until 2015, 2016, somewhere in there. Early 2016. So a lot of stuff in Visual Studio I'm actually still like not very familiar with. So what's funny is like I've never used this peak definition before, where it like loads the file like inside of another file. It's actually kind of cool. It's not what I want in this case, but it's kind of cool. So normally I just go to definition. There we go. So eventually what I want to do is I want to just kind of refresh my own memory. So something that happens to me all the time when I'm programming is I'll write a class or I'll write a series of classes or this whole project or whole system architecture, and I'll start doing something else like working on UI or working on some other side of the excuse me, the app, and then I'll get back to this code and I'll be like, what the hell was I doing? I don't remember. So so I need to go back in here and remember kind of exactly what I'm doing. So it looks like the only stuff that the base class actually does is it provides, let's see here, it provides an isInitialization bool. Excuse me. It provides initialization progress, okay? It sets us to not destroy on load, which is good. That's definitely what we want to do. And then we initialize ourselves as soon as the app starts. Okay, so that's pretty self-explanatory there. So our pop-up manager, we pretty much, so we want all those base things to happen, and then we want to kind of do some of our own stuff, possibly. But really, it looks like, well, all we're going to want here are some, oh, excuse me. So let's go back into here. What do we call it? Yeah. So really all we want here is we just want some helper methods. Oh, pound helper methods. Nah. Pound region helper methods. There we go. I'm losing my mind. It is turning to Swiss cheese. Okay, so we just want some helper methods that are going to allow us to do the things that we need to do with the pop-ups. So let's kind of go over here and let's start kind of designing out what the pop-up manager is going to need to do. So we're going to go pop-up manager. So thinking about what the pop-up manager needs to do. So one of the things it definitely needs to do is it definitely needs to be able to somehow resolve, okay, it needs to provide, let's see here, so it needs to provide public methods to create pop-ups based on args. Okay, and then what are those args going to be? So we're going to need to know, let's see here, title. We're going to need to be able to pass in content. We need to be able to pass in, possibly we could do things, we could go even more crazy. We could do things like, in the future, right now I'm not going to worry about it so much, but in the future we could do things like changing the background image, changing the, excuse me, the background tint. Possibly maybe there's an icon, whether it's like a warning pop-up or a message pop-up or like some type of error pop-up like, oh, you did something wrong. So those are things that we could pass in, definitely pass in the future. But for now, we're just going to go title, content. Let's see here. How many buttons? Ooh, how many buttons? What do buttons say? And what do buttons do? Cool. So, so these are going to be kind of the the main things that we want to do inside of our method to create a pop-up. So it looks like, honestly, that might be the only thing that we need to do in here outside of the creating like an instance for us to access the public methods here on our pop-up. So did I create? Yeah, static properties. So I'm just going to copy and paste how we did it on our Save Game Manager. Again, this just makes life easy and fast. So no reason I have to retype this stuff when I know exactly what I'm doing. I know exactly what I'm doing. Sound like an idiot. No reason to retype this stuff when it's going to be doing the exact same thing. That's what I meant to say. Let's see here. Okay, that looks good. So I'm going to go back here. Just fix my line endings, which is, again, it's a really annoying problem. Excuse me. Okay. So we need to create this public method, create the pop-up. So this could be as simple as, let's see here, public void. And actually, what do we want to create? So I'm starting to think, I'm thinking about how I want to create these. So obviously we know we want to load it from our resources directory here. Okay. So the question is, how do we know what pop-up we want to create? So currently we only have one pop-up, so it's not that hard. But let's say we had specific pop-ups that you wanted to create. So I'm thinking about creating some type of mapping, possibly between. I'm thinking about creating a map between an enum value and a string. So the enum value would be what type of pop-up that you want to create. And then the string would just be the path or the name inside resources to get that pop-up. So, so let's go and let's create. So let's see here. Let's create a region called enums. And let's see here. And region. And then let's go public enum. And let's call this enum pop-up. Pop-up tips. Okay. So right now, again, we only have generic. But at a certain point, at least when you have some design in your head about how to do Unity. So person in the chat whose name is really long. Lil Uzi, yeah. How to do Unity. Unity's pretty easy. It's definitely easy to get started in. It's kind of hard to master, easy to get started in, but how to do Unity. Unity's hard. I don't think, Unity's easy, sorry. Me doing Unity is hard. I don't know how, I'm doing a tutorial here, kind of, so I don't know how much I recommend following exactly what I do. But anyways, back to what I was saying. So in our pop-up types, so we have generic. Most likely, based on what I have in my head about how the game's going to work at this point, I imagine in the future that we're going to have more pop-up types. Another one that I can think of off the top of my head immediately would be an achievement notification. So saying like, hey, you got this achievement. Here's a thing to do. Or here's a reward or something like that. That would be another type of pop-up. I don't think I would want to use the generic pop-up for that. You know, possibly I could. I think another pop-up type would possibly also be tutorial. So, hey, pop up a message saying, this is how you play the game. Do this, do this. Possibly popping up something that shows like an arrow telling you to click something. That would be another type of pop-up that would require, again, another prefab. So effectively, this enum directory, this enum list here is going to be all the different prefabs. So if we have 5 different prefabs in terms of pop-up prefabs, then we're probably also going to then have 5 different enums here. So that's kind of that mapping that I was talking about. So again, this pop-up, generic pop-up type is going to be mapped to our let's see, our pop-up generic here under resources pop-up generic. Yeah, I know I have an error. I'm not done doing what I'm doing, bro. You can calm down. So, anyway, so let's go back down to our helper method here. So we're going to do public. For now, we're just going to do void. Maybe we'll return the actual object we created. Maybe we actually want to do that already. So, so we're getting a little bit of ahead of ourselves. So let's just do void create pop-up. And we're going to do our pop-up type. And then it's going to be the type of pop-up that you want. And then we're going to start passing in some of the information that we need to know how to set this pop-up up. So we have title. So we want to do string title. And then we have content. So we're going to do string content. And then how many buttons, what buttons say, and what buttons do. So this is where it gets a little more complicated because sure, we could pass in an int that says how many buttons, and then we could pass in maybe a list of strings or something for what buttons say and what buttons do. It gets a little bit more complicated. So what we want to do is we actually want to create, let's create a subclass here. Region subclasses. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a pop-up button object. So public class pop-up button object. What my save game object? Did I do? Okay. So I'm just looking at how I named the save game object. So the fact that I used obj instead of object, I just want to make sure I'm consistent from one file to another. So if you ever catch me doing that, like going back and looking at something else, the main reason I'm looking at this is just to see how I named it. So that way, the save game object. So that way I can be consistent from one file to another. That's just going to make your code cleaner, easier to debug, easier to understand. I think, like, yeah, having some type of standard coding practices around that kind of stuff is an important thing. So yeah, let's go and let's create this, which is going to be system.object. And again, I don't have to put this here. This is implied. So if I would just take this away, it would be the same. Again, I just like to be clear. It doesn't hurt anything putting it there. It just makes it a little more obvious to anybody that when they would come look at this. Granted, again, I'm the only programmer on this as far as I know. So, does it really matter? In my case, no. But in my opinion, it's a good habit to get into. So, okay. So let's go back down here. So what I want to do is I actually want to pass in a list of these pop-up button objects. So by passing in a list in here, what did I do wrong? Oh, I didn't name these. So we're going to go buttons. So by passing in a list of these pop-up button objects, we can use this class to achieve what we want. So how many buttons? That's easy. How many buttons are you passing in? Okay. If your list has one button in it, then we know you want one button. If your list would have 2 buttons, we know you want 2 buttons. If your list would have 3 buttons, we would know you want 3 buttons. Now, granted, that's not going to work very good for our generic pop-up type since that's limited to 2 buttons. So that's something we should definitely think about. So let's go ahead and throw in a check for that real quick. So let's go. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up a switch. We're going to switch off the type that you wanted to create. So again, for now, there's only one type, which is generic. And then let's go ahead and start thinking about how this might work in the future. So let's set up a default. So again, anybody that's new to programming, inside of a switch statement, effectively what it does is it looks at this variable, this type. It says, okay, what is it? And then if you have a case set up for that type, it will then fall into this case and it will do things here. Okay? It'll run the code that you have there. Now, default, on the other hand, what default works for is that anything that doesn't get hit in here, so anything you don't have a case set up for, what's going to happen is it's going to fall into this default section. So what's nice about that is we can then put a log here, so which we're going to do as a warning, because this is, something that I would consider a warning. So you could do it as an error, but I think it's at least in a warning. And we're going to say, we're going to do, let's see, pop-up manager dot create popup. So what we want to do here is we want to spit out a message that's letting us know that, oh crap, you're effectively you're trying to run code that you haven't written yet. So we're going to say missing case for pop up type, and then pass in the pop-up type that was trying to be looked for. So what's going to happen here is, in the future, let's say I create another pop-up, like an achievement pop-up. Okay, I go ahead, I create the prefab, I throw it in here, I make achievement, throw it in there, and then I try to call it. I try to call create pop-up, and it's just not doing anything. I'm calling create pop-up, nothing's happening because I'm passing in the type of achievement, and I don't have a case set up to actually do something with it. So, so what can happen there is I would obviously be like, I have no idea what's going on because like my code's not working. It should be working. But what's cool is by setting up this warning, anytime I get in that situation, I can look in the console and I will be getting a message. Because this could be, 6 months from now. And I could forget that I wrote this code. But 6 months from now, though, I'll get this message and be able to see, oh, I never set up a case in here for, achievement, which would be popped out there. So that's a cool thing. But yeah, we're going to do things in here. What we're going to do, I don't know exactly yet, but we're going to do some stuff in there. First, I want to focus on this pop-up button object. So, first thing we need to know, okay, how many buttons? That's easy. That's just how many buttons are passed in, okay? Ooh, that's what I want to do. So, first thing I want to do in here is I want to check to make sure we can set up this pop-up. I guess setup is not really create. So again, if we're using the generic pop-up prefab, so that's the prefab that we created here. So if you remember, that only had 2 buttons on it. Oh my god. All right, Precision, you are killing me right now. Hold on one second. Go away. In our pop-up generic here, we only have 2 buttons, okay? So if we ever try to create a pop-up with more than 2 buttons of type generic, it's not going to work. We're not going to be able to. So what we want to do is we first want to make sure to kind of safeguard against this. So we're going to check to see how many buttons we passed in. So if the count of our buttons is greater than 2, meaning we can't create this pop-up, what we want to do is we want to send, like, throw error, so debug.log error. I'm going to copy part of this message. So pop-up manager, create pop-up, and then the error message is going to be cannot create generic pop-up with more than 2 buttons. Boom. So again, this is just going to help prevent us from programming something incorrectly. So a lot of the times what will end up happening is, let's say we have a pop-up and we're using a generic pop-up for it, and let's say this buttons is something that's more variable. Like let's say we're loading data off disk, and based on what we're loading, we're creating that many buttons for this pop-up. So that could be a situation where something could work. It could just continually work. And then all of a sudden, now we have 3 bits of data instead of 2 or 1. And now all of a sudden, the generic pop-up no longer works for it. But we'll just start seeing the game not working correctly. So getting these errors while developing are going to make sure that less bugs make it into the final product. So it's not all about programming your app and then finding bugs through playing it. That's part of it, you know what I mean? Like having like actual QA run through it and stuff. But when you're like one guy and you don't have QA to test your stuff for you, making sure that you kind of safeguard yourself against stuff like in this situation is probably the best thing that you can do, in my opinion. So, we're going to go else. So in that case, we would not actually create the pop-up. We just want to throw this error and then break out of here, which we're doing here. So yeah, we're going to make this an if else, so that way down here is where we're actually create this pop-up. So, anyways, so let's go back up to our pop-up button object. So again, how many buttons, that's determined by just how many we pass in. So now we have, okay, what do the buttons say on them? So for every button object that gets passed in, we need string, and that string is going to be, let's see here, button, and then it's just going to be string.empty. Okay. So it's going to be up to the person that creates or calls this create pop-up, the person. It's going to be up to the code that calls this create pop-up. It's going to be up to them in order to pass in buttons objects, okay, that have these things set on them, this button text and what do the buttons do, okay? So the button text is pretty easy, okay? We can just make a string and then just pass that along to the button that we create, okay? But things get a little more complicated when you start thinking about, okay, how do I control what the buttons do, if that makes sense? Like what happens when I click this button? So that's where things get a little more complicated. But it's not too easy to achieve this. So effectively what we want to have happen is we want our button objects here, okay? We want to have, for each button, we want to have a callback that we can set up that will be fired when you press that button, okay? So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add an extra thing here. And this is going to help facilitate what I'm talking about the kind of dynamic button generation and then getting callbacks based on those. So we're going to create another string here, and we're just going to call this ID, and that's also going to be string dot excuse me, dot empty. So this is the reason this is important is we're going to create a delegate here that we're going to then use as an event handler to get a callback about. So we want to make sure that something's getting passed in that callback, so that way we know what button has been pressed. So this ID, that's what's going to be sent back. So effectively, the way this code is going to work is something like our, let's go back to our, what was it, options? Our UI options, okay? So remember, this whole thing is about popping up a pop-up when we hit reset all data to say, hey, are you sure you want to reset all the data? So inside here is where we're going to be calling, let's see here. Calling create pop-up. Okay, so inside here, so when we hit our reset all data, we're going to be saying, okay, create pop-up, and we're going to pass in a bunch of information about how to create the pop-up. Okay, but what we're also going to get out of this is we're going to get an event that we can subscribe to that's going to be called when the pop-up is called. Okay, or well, that's something we're going to pass in. We're going to say, hey, call this method every time a button is pressed. Sorry, not a pop-up is called. Every time a button on the pop-up is pressed. And then we can create then another method in here that's like private void on pop-up button pressed. And then that's going to have string ID. And then this method is going to be called every time a pop-up button is pressed. And since we excuse me, know the IDs of the buttons that are set up because we're the ones setting up the buttons in this method here, we can then just switch off of that ID that comes back and then do things based on that. So we're going to get to that in the future. I just kind of wanted to give a little bit of a little glimpse into the road that we're going down right now. But all right, so let's get back to this. So we have ID. So what we're going to need is we're going to need to create. Up here, let's go. And then so we're gonna create a public delegate void, and that's gonna be what are we gonna call this? We're gonna call this pop-up button event handler, and then we're gonna pass in a string ID. I think that's the syntax of that. And then here, what we can do is we can say. Let's call this pop-up button on click. Pop-up button on click. There we go. Yeah. Oh, God damn it. Effectively, by creating a delegate like this, it allows us to use that as a type, and then call this. Let's see, our button. Let's see your button callback. But what's important here is, I just realized, is I actually don't need to send in a callback for each button individually. That doesn't make sense. Based on, so, okay. So there's two different ways you could do this. Number one, you could say each button has an ID. You have one callback, and then you just switch off the ID to know what logic to do. That's one option, okay? The other option is don't have this, okay? Have each button have its own callback, and then that way you say, okay, do this when this button is called, do this when this button is called. That's one way to do it. I'm going to go with the route of ID just because there's going to be some scenarios where I don't feel like creating possibly, you know, like 15 methods if I had 15 buttons. Maybe I just want to create one method. So that's the route that I'm going to go. So what I'm actually going to do here is, that's fine. I can create that and keep that in there. An ID and button. So where? Okay. So in here, we just need to also create. So I'm going to throw this up here, I guess. Pound region. And region. So effectively, yeah, I'm taking this outside of the button object itself. And instead, it's going to live in the pop-up manager. And then you're just going to be, it's going to be up to the person calling create pop-up. Oh, God damn it. To also pass in a callback. Button on, click callback. All right, and our method is getting very long, so I'm going to split that up in half. There we go. Excuse me. Man, coughs. I hate coughs. Bronchitis be the death of me. Even my first time ever having bronchitis, it's like, it's not that like painful or anything. It's just really, really annoying. Like, constantly coughing is really annoying. So, okay. So somebody in the chat's asking a question. So yeah, anybody that has questions, by the way, as I'm going along, feel free to write in the chat. Anytime I get like a break for a second, I will look in the chat and try to answer the questions. So, so somebody asks, why are you explicitly inheriting from system.object? I just joined the stream. Excuse me if you explained it earlier. Okay. So, I did explain it earlier. Bash Mohandes X. I don't know how to say your name. But anyways, so the reason I'm explicitly inheriting from system.object. So number one, like I mentioned before, you could easily do this. Okay. You could just create your class. It automatically inherits from system.object if you don't do anything. You could do that and it would work just fine. There's no issue with that. The main reason I'm doing it is just due to the fact it increases readability. It makes sometimes debugging easier, possibly. But the big thing was like when I was first getting into programming professionally, okay, the first couple games I made in Unity, I actually made in JavaScript, not C#, okay? So I didn't have a ton of experience with C-style languages, okay? So for me, like right away, I didn't know, straight up, I didn't know that if you didn't put what class to inherit from, that it would automatically inherit from system.object. I didn't know that. So for me, it was very beneficial for people to put in that it was like explicitly put in that it was inheriting from system.object, just so that way, like as somebody as like a super newbie, I could see that and understand that. So for me, whenever I'm doing like a tutorial or a stream or working with like really, really junior engineers, I like to just put that in there so that way people like can look at it and immediately be like, oh yeah, that's a system object. I knew that, but I just didn't think of it, like, you know, or whatever it be. So hopefully that answers your question. That's the reason I do it. Obviously I understand you don't need to do it, and I try to mention that every time I every time I write a new class, I'll mention that you don't have to do that. But for me, I do that, and that's personally just for readability of people that are and understandability for people that are somewhat new to programming. Oh, excuse me. But anyways, so hopefully that answers your question. If not, feel free to write again or email me. I've had several people email me with questions, and again, that's always the easiest way to get a good answer from me. It allows me time to actually like respond and think about your question and stuff. So feel free to email me if you have any questions. Anybody else as well. So anywho, so oh, dying over here. Okay, so now we have our create pop-up method. we still need to effectively do things, so do our actual creation, but we have kind of the structure of it like set at this point. So what we need to do now is we need to figure out, okay, after we create this this pop-up, how are we going to set it up? How are we going to actually go through and say, oh, we only want one button, we only want two buttons, we want these things to be set to it? So one of the options is we could create it here, okay? We could create the pop-up, and then we could scan through the pop-up, find the title text, find the content text, find a bunch of stuff and set it and do that, whatever. Personally, I don't like that. That's too much work. There's too much things in the pop-up manager to do. The pop-up manager should be equivalent of like a good actual manager, in my opinion, which is it can create the pop-up, it can give the pop-up a job or tell the pop-up what to do, but then the pop-up kind of just goes and does its own thing. The pop-up manager is there for any like high-level things it needs to do, but the pop-up manager or the pop-up itself would be effectively handling itself. So, excuse me. So what we're going to do is we're going to create some more code now to effectively do that, to manage initializing and setting up the actual pop-up. So let's go to UI, and this is not a UI screen. Instead, this would be a UI, let's just call this a UI element, sure. I guess I would call a pop-up a UI element. It could be a screen, and we're just going to call it an element. So we're going to create a C# class here, and I'm going to call it UI pop-up. So our UI pop-up is going to then live on our generic pop-up. So we're just going to go ahead and already put this code on here. Bloop. So then what's nice about this is what we're going to be able to do then is in Pop-Up Manager, we're going to be able to, so instead of do things, we're going to do a couple things. So we're going to create, let's use the correct terminology in Unity. So we're going to instantiate, aka create generic pop-up, and then we're going to tell UI pop-up to initialize with data that was sent as params. Okay, so effectively the workflow is going to be somewhere in our code. So in UI options here, we're going to call create pop-up. Okay, at that point we're going to get in here to this block right here where we're going to actually create the pop-up itself. So we're going to load the prefab from the resources directory. We're going to instantiate it into the game. Then we're going to tell the code that's on pop-up, okay, which we just created, the UI pop-up. We're going to tell that code to initialize. Oops, sorry, back in here. We're going to tell that code to initialize with the parameters that got sent in, or the ones that it cares about. So what UI pop-up needs to do is UI pop-up then needs to have, so let's region, let's go. It needs to have a public void and initialize method. That is not at all what I wanted to have happen. Auto type killing me. All right, we want a method just called initialize. I don't know why it decided, hey, you wanted on server initialize, right? That's what you wanted. Nope, that's not what I wanted, Visual Studio, but thanks for trying. So, so in our initialize method, effectively what we need to do is we need to set up some things, okay? So we need to say, okay, we need to set up our title. We need to set up our content. Excuse me. We need to set up our we need to set up what our buttons, how many buttons we have, what their text says, what gets called when they're clicked, stuff like that. All that needs to get set up here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change things around a little bit here. So we have this UI pop-up. So thinking about going in the future, like I talked about before, we're probably going to want, yeah, I know there's inconsistent line endings. There's always inconsistent line endings. Thanks for reminding me. We're probably going to want multiple pop-ups. So remember I was talking about that before. So we should probably, let's rename, first of all, let's rename this elements, because there's more than one element. And then we're going to create a folder inside of there. We'll call this Popup. And then we're going to create another folder. Call this base. We're going to create another folder. Derived. That folder goes at this level. So we're actually going to use, let's use this UI Popup as like our base class. And then let's create some different pop-ups. Okay, so let's create our only pop-up that we have now, which is the generic pop-up. But let's call UI Popup generic. So this is going to have, so there's going to be a level of base logic, okay, inside UI Popup. And that base logic is going to be for things that all the pop-ups are going to have, okay? Such as logic to like kill itself, you know what I mean, to close the pop-up. Logic to maybe hide the pop-up, maybe logic to disable the pop-up. I don't know, things like that. Things that would be common across all pop-ups, okay? And then UI Popup generic, which is the actual code that we want on here now. So that's actually going to have the specific things for generic pop-up, like what a generic pop-up needs to do. So let's go to our UI generic pop-up. And let's call this, let's do UI pop-up. And then let's see here. Okay, cool. So first of all, we got to start thinking about, okay, what are the things that we need to do in this pop-up? So we already have this initialization. So now we're going to make this virtual. So in the base UI pop-up, what do we need to do in the initialize? So I don't know if we need to do anything as of this point. I'm debating whether or not. I mean, this is probably good for the future. You know what I mean? Having a UI pop-up base and then like kind of having each one of our derivative classes. So right now the base is probably not going to do much of anything. Mainly due to the fact that we only have one pop-up, so it's kind of hard to think about now, like, okay, what is the difference between the achievement pop-up and our generic pop-up, or, you know, anything along those lines. So we're going to pretty much just work in this, in kind of this in the generic pop-up, but keep in mind that we do have a base class that we could use in theory if we needed to. So let's go helper methods. But the main thing we need to do now is we got to figure out how to initialize this pop-up. Like, what do we actually need to do? So we can call the base. Let's find the base. So we can do shit for now. But okay, so we need to set the title. We need to set the content. And we need to set up the buttons effectively. So first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to. Okay, you know what? I'm going back on my stuff. So as of right now, I only have one pop-up. I'm not really worried about it. I'm just going to call, man. See, this is where it always gets complicated. Because effectively, I want to get something done. Like, I want to get this generic pop-up working. I just want to get it in. You know what I mean? So it's like, do I spend the time now architecting for the future, or do I not need to? You know what I mean? Like, right now I could just say, okay, I'm just going to create one pop-up piece of code, and I'm just going to work with that. And then when I get to the second pop-up, I'll split it up then and make a base and, you know, do whatever. But ends up what happening is that causes me more work later. So it's always like, do I do more work now or do more work later? I don't know. It's always a tricky situation. But I'm kind of leaning towards the fact of just doing more work later. So I'm actually going to nuke this UI pop-up generic. I'm going to keep this folder structure because that's probably what I'm going to work with in the future. And then I'm going to put this UI pop-up here. So what I'm going to do is effectively I'm just going to do all the generic pop-up logic in the base, and then in the future, when I add more pop-ups, see, that's the problem. I don't know if I'm going to or not. I don't really want to spend the time architecting it this way because I don't know if I am going to in the future. But if I do add more pop-ups in the future, what I'll do is then I can just make this the base. I can pull any of the generic specific logic out of this and put it in some more, you know, derivative class that like I had before. So, but for now, I'm gonna kind of go backtrack a little bit. Region, end region. Okay. Somebody in the chat says, what is the difference between the initialize method and plain old constructors? So, the main thing for me is the initialize method. And again, this is, I'm always talking from a Unity standpoint, so this could possibly, other engines, other systems, this could all be different. But the main thing for me is initialize is something that I can control when it's called, number one. Okay, versus when it's like a constructor being called as soon as the script is created. Okay, number one. Number two, I can run logic in here, so I can actually like call other methods from here and stuff like that. Versus a constructor where you can really only set variables and do more simple stuff. And then number three, a constructor only allows me to like set the variables, like the member variables of this class. So, so you'll see in this initialization method, I'm going to do a lot more than you would normally do in a constructor. But now, don't get me wrong, very similar kind of motivation behind both of them. You know what I mean? The difference being is that, yeah, is the main difference is just like what I'm allowed to do in here and when I'm allowed to call it versus a constructor limiting what I can do and when I can do it, if that makes sense. Because like, let's say initialize, possibly I want to reinitialize the pop-up at like a random ass time. So I want to be able to just call this method at any time versus the constructor not being exactly that same setup, if that makes sense. I hope that explained. That was probably a bad explanation. Yeah, I don't know. Hopefully that worked. So, but anyways, so we want to start creating some region. Member variables. So remember, what do we need to do? Well, we need to be able to mess with the title, mess with the content, and mess with the buttons. So effectively, we need to create some serialized fields here to allow us to have access inside of our pop-up. Okay, so which I'm also gonna come on. Our pop-up, which I'm gonna try to drag into the scene here so I can edit it. Okay. So so we need access to these things, to these UI elements that we've created. Okay. So in order, what is it mad about? You should live there. So in order to get access to this stuff, again, we're going to make some serialized variables that we can then set to what we need for our UI elements for our pop-up initialization. So we go UI. And then in here we're going to go private, and then we're going to do title, so that's a text, so private text, we're just going to call this underscore title text equals null, and then private text underscore content text null, and then, so we need another serialized field there, okay, and then we need, what else? Okay, so now we need our buttons. So we have two buttons. So normally, I mean, okay, so let's just do, yeah, so let's go serialized field. Let's go private. I'm going to make it an array just because it's going to be, maybe, it's going to be a little bit easier to work with in the future that way. Since we're passing in our buttons as a list of those button objects from our pop-up manager class, so these pop-up button objects, since we're already going to have a list of those, it's easy to just kind of maintain that same like array list collection structure. So we're going to go buttons, and we're just going to call these what to do buttons. Okay. I don't know why I didn't want to autocomplete that. Maybe did I have the syntax wrong there? I don't think so. Is that right? It was weird. Didn't want to autocomplete for some reason. Okay, cool. So, okay, cool. So now we have our text that we need to set, and we have our buttons. Okay. So, let's see here. So what's it going to do? Okay. So some of the other stuff that we're going to need to worry about is effectively we need to handle, okay, what happens when our button does something, okay? So we'll get to that eventually, but these are things that we need to start thinking of as we're kind of going through and architecting this. So effectively what's going to happen, like the loop again now up to this point, is we hit reset all data. That creates a pop-up based on the parameters that we pass in, okay? So the parameters get passed into here, which then, so we instantiate it, and then we tell it to initialize. So we're going to call into UI pop-up, okay, of the one that we just created, and we're going to tell it to initialize. So what are the things we need to pass in? So we need string title, we need string content, and then we need that list of, what do we call those? Pop-up manager, button objects. Buttons. Cool. So those are the things that we need to get passed in for sure. But then we also have this pop-up button on click event handler. Ugh, words. So we're going to pass this in as well. And again, now my thing is huge. Cool. Oh yeah, it doesn't know about this because it lives in pop-up manager. I'm actually gonna, now that I did that, I'm gonna do that, and then go, yay, formatting, the funsies. So, okay, so effectively at this point now, we have a bunch of like information. So, but we know that we're gonna need to call this later. So, I'm actually going to go ahead and set another private variable here. So private, so this is kind of how this initialization, so somebody asked it before, what's the difference between this and like a constructor? So for example, this is very similar to a constructor at this point, based on what I'm doing. Oh, excuse me. Wait, can I not equal null? I can equal null, right? I can equal null, yeah. So first thing that I'm going to do is just straight up set our member variable to the button on click callback that comes through. So that's the first thing I'm going to do. So some of the other stuff that I need to do in here. So I need to, let's see, I need to subscribe. So I need to subscribe. I don't know, what were we using before? We register event callbacks for our buttons. So we'll need to do that in here. We'll need to set title text. Then we'll need to also set content text. I think, oh, we'll also need to set button text. A lot of text that we need to set. Cool. I think that's pretty much what we need to do, and then we need to, let's see, store our callback to be invoked when a button is pressed. So effectively what we're going to do is we're actually going to have our callbacks. So we're actually going to subscribe directly to our pop-up callback. But since that's just like an empty, or sorry, each of our pop-up buttons, we're going to explicitly subscribe to each of their callbacks. Then in another method here, so let's do another region. Okay, so down here, we're then going to explicitly say like, okay, this method is called when pop-up button 1 is called, or 0 is called, and this one's called when pop-up button 1 is called, okay? Then we're also going to have, excuse me, we're also going to have a mapping between which button has what ID. Because remember, we're passing in here, this pop-up button object has an ID in there. So that way, when pop-up button 0, element 0 in this array is pressed, we can then call our pop-up button callback with the ID of that button. So you see how there's kind of a loop now? But anyways, I'm gonna go to the bathroom real quick though. I need a bathroom break. So let's see here, bathroom break. I will be right back. But yeah, so when I get back, we'll talk about how we're gonna kind of finish this loop here. Hopefully, we can get this generic pop-up popping up pretty soon. It's so crazy is how like in programming and in stuff and making games, the littlest things like creating a pop-up that has some dynamic data in it, how that can take so long. I mean, we've been working on this for like an hour. It's crazy. All right, I am back. So anyways, so talking about like okay, how we're gonna manage these buttons. So we're gonna need a way to say, okay, button 0 has this ID and button 1 has this ID, or however it may be. So, but first we got to figure out. Actually, probably the first thing we got to figure out is how many buttons do we actually want on screen. So let's see here. How many buttons? So we know that our count here of this list is going to determine how many buttons we actually want to show. So so what we probably want to do is we want to do something along the lines of, let's see here, buttons. What would we call that? We call that pop-up buttons, right? Pop-up buttons. GameObject. So we need to be able to turn on our buttons, turn on and off our buttons based on how many buttons we actually passed in here. So the first thing we can do is just how many buttons are active. So we're answering that question easily by just what's the count. So we can say buttons dot count greater than 0. So in theory, yeah, we're always going to have at least one button, I guess. Possibly we're not going to have one button, you know what I mean? Possibly we're going to have 0 buttons in a certain case. Like let's say there's a pop-up that shows up that's like, your game is screwed and you can't do anything but close the app. I don't know, maybe. Either way, we're going to give the ability to do that. So let's go ahead and do another. Let's do pop-up button 1. And yeah, we're just doing the same thing. So I'll set that active, buttons.count. This is the one that's actually going to be used more frequently. So this one is just saying, okay, we have our count is at least 1. Or our count is at least 2 in this case, meaning that we have 2 buttons passed in, so we want our pop-up button 1 to also be active. So that's easily deciding, okay, how many buttons are active. Okay, so now that we know how many buttons are active, we need to then go through and we need to register the callbacks for these buttons. Okay, so again, like I said, we're gonna have let's go private void on button. Again, this maybe isn't the best way to do this, but it's definitely a way that's gonna work. So I'm gonna do on a pop up button 0. Alright, we're gonna go A and B. I don't like using like numbers ever in anything. I don't even know if you can. Can you do numbers? Will that actually work? This is how infrequently I actually use. Okay, apparently you can do numbers. I'm not going to do numbers though. We're going to do A. We're going to do A and B. Numbers scare me. So we're going to go on pop-up button A and on pop-up button B. Yeah, there we go. So again, so we need to be able to store though. We need to know, okay, what button and what's like the idea of that button. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do it this way. Again, there's probably a better way to do this. There's always better ways. Not necessarily a better way. Sorry, I won't say that. There's definitely different ways to do it. And that's something that's the beauty of programming in general, is that there's 5,000 ways to solve any problem. But effectively, I'm just going to create a string that's going to be pop-up button ID. And then it's going to equal new string of size 2. And effectively, this array is just going to mimic this array here. And we're just going to go through and set up so that way on button A is stored with the button A in here, button 0's ID that is going to be passed in. So remember our button object here when we go to that is set up for this string ID. So we're going to go, what we're going to do here is just loop through share button for int I equals 0 I. What's so funny is like just going to the bathroom, that amount of time of like kind of just getting away, like I felt like, man, we were on a roll, we were really going on stuff. Just taking like that 30-second break. Now I'm like all like confused. I'm like, what the heck were we even doing? So funny how that works. Pressure buttons dot count. Okay, and then for each button, I need to grab the ID from that button. So yeah, and now that I have that ID, I need to set that to our pop-up button IDs. Blue. Yay, cool. So what's nice about this, oh, that's not, I need that to be an I. There we go. Is that's just going to go ahead and set all those. So now we also want to register a callback for each of these. So we're going to go underscore pop-up button, pop-up buttons. There we go. I dot on click dot add listener, and then oh wait, so no, we don't want to do it here. See, here's again me being all like out of my brain. This is just set up IDs, and then I guess we can call register IDs. That works too. So register callback. So what we actually want to do here, again, I just don't feel like typing this like 10 times. So dot on click dot add listener. There we go. And then we want to do on pop-up button A, and then same thing here. Click dot add listener dash on pop-up button B. Bam! There we go. All right, so that's looking good. So each of these are going to be called now. Let's see here. Take a second here. Somebody asking in the chat, kind of unrelated question. For game programming using Unity, what is your average PC specs? CPU, GPU, etc. So what's kind of funny is, so first of all, I answered this question really in depth in my very first stream. So if you want a longer answer, please go back to the go to my YouTube channel. Go to the very first stream, so Making a Game episode 1. And you will definitely be able to get a really long-winded answer to this. But effectively, Unity itself doesn't require any specific CPU, GPU. So I'm using, I have a 4770K. This is like my gaming computer that I'm currently using. And mainly I just do that because it's good for streaming as well. But I have a 4770K, GTX 980 Ti, 16 gigs of RAM, like custom water cooled. It's whatever. But this is like my gaming computer. Again, that's not what you necessarily need for Unity. I've also, like when I'm on the train or I'm programming like mobily or whatever, I use like a Dell XPS 13 laptop that I've had for like 5 years. At like work, or 4 years, or I don't know. I got it like right when they came out. And then at work I just use a MacBook Pro for like my day job. So it really just depends. So the easiest kind of rule of thumb that I can say is whatever game you're trying to develop, based on the hardware that it's running on. So let's say you're making a mobile game, like you don't need a very good computer. You need, in my opinion, you need about 25% faster of a computer than the thing you're trying to develop for, if that makes sense. That's kind of the easiest rule of thumb. Really though, the best thing you can do is in terms of like a game development machine, especially if you're just doing like a 2D game or something like that, like especially if you're writing code. I mean, just having a fast processor is going to be good because it makes code compiling faster. So like in my day job, we have like a really complex like code base. So when we make a build, it currently takes about 15 minutes just to compile our code for like when we make a build. So because of that, we like, granted we have MacBook Pros, which aren't like the fastest, but like we all have to have a 15-inch with the best CPU because of the fact that it takes so long to compile our code. So yeah, so that's hopefully that's a good answer. But remember, like I said, I answered this really more in depth in my first stream. So please go back and look at that. And there's also in the YouTube video, so the videos are long, like 3 hours, but in the YouTube videos in the description, there's timestamps. So just find the timestamps. I believe that's like general Q&A or audience Q&A. And that's when I talk about what PC you need. So anyways, so somebody's asking which environment is Unity? Which environment is Unity that you are using? So I'm not sure exactly what you're asking. It's worded a little funky, but number one, so I'm using Visual Studio. So I'm on PC, so Windows 10. I'm using Unity. Oh, which Unity is this? I haven't updated in okay, maybe? Okay. Oh, god damn. EVGA Precision, you are killing me right now. It keeps turning the on-screen thing. I really need to change my key command because it's Shift-T to turn it on, which is like just way too easy to accidentally do. So, but anyways. So I'm using Unity 5.50 F3, okay? I'm using Visual Studio, the one that comes bundled with Unity, which I think is Visual Studio Community. I'm using that as the code editor. I'm using, like I said, Windows 10. So it's a PC, Windows 10. I don't know what else, other questions you want in terms of environment, but that's so that's what I'm currently using it. But I also, I use Unity on my Mac, like for work. I use a MacBook Pro, whatever the latest version of Unity is, and then in there we use Mono Develop instead of Visual Studio. So. Okay, so somebody's asking, probably a dumb question, but I'm very new in this universe of programming. Sometimes I feel like I can't catch the logic behind it. Sometimes I have troubles to think of a way to write a function, for example. Again, I'm brand new in learning. Do you have some advice and a good way to think like a computer? So to answer your question, how to kind of come up with how to write a function, for example. So my personal method, now this might not work for you, and I think everybody, definitely there's 100 ways to program, if not thousands, if not millions. It's one of the beauties of programming, but I think each person kind of finds their own little niche or whatever, or what works best for them. So the best I can do is tell you what works for me. So anyways, so what works for me personally is, first thing I do is I think about, okay, what is the problem I'm trying to solve? Okay. Like, what is, as a very global thing, like, what am I trying to do? Then I start breaking it down in little pieces, and I go, okay, well, what's a smaller part of that global problem can I look at? So right now we're talking about the global problem is making a generic pop-up, okay, that it can be dynamically created at any time. So the pop-up needs to be created at any time. It needs to have a title, content, and some buttons on it. The buttons need to be like generic in terms of there could be one button, there could be two buttons, stuff like that. So those are requirements. once you have the requirements, then you can start looking at it from a smaller perspective. So you can say like, okay, I need to create the pop-up. Okay. That's like one thing to do. So that's kind of how we started in Pop-Up Manager, where we were saying, okay, I need to create the pop-up. So I created a method for create pop-up. Then I also broke it down. I'm like, okay, once the pop-up is created, we need to set it up or initialize it. We need to make it like look the way we want it to look. So that's where this initialization method comes in. And here's a good example of how I do kind of the inter method, like inside the method setup. So what I personally like to do is I like to go through before I wrote any code. So I don't know how long you've been in the stream, but before I wrote any code, the first thing I did was anything that was in my head that I could think of that I needed to do in this method, I just wrote down in comments. So I said, okay, I need to set up how many buttons are active. Then I need to register callbacks. Then I need to register IDs. Then I need to set title text. Then I need to set content text. Then I need to set button text. And then I need to store a callback to be invoked later when it's pressed. So I went through and so that's called pseudocode, okay? So effectively, I came up with like the algorithm, like what's going to happen in this method. And remember, like at least most programming languages, the way code works is you're going to start at the top and just work your way down. So think about it kind of like chronologically almost, like, okay, once I get here, what do I want to happen? Well, I want to initialize. I want to set up the title, the content, and the buttons. Okay. So start thinking about, okay, how do each of those things needs to happen? So at first it's like, okay, well, how many buttons do I want to show? I got to answer that question. Then I got to answer this question. Then I need to do this thing. So I start out by like writing comments about all the different things that I need to do in that method. Then after I'm done, I go through and then I start populating underneath those comments to actually do those things. So how many buttons are active, like showing and hiding? So I set that up. Then it's like, okay, now I register the callbacks. And then now I register the IDs. And then next I'll set the title text. And then so on and so forth. And then next thing you know, a lot of the times, once you start coding and actually filling out the method, the body of the method, you'll think of more things that you might need to do in that method, but you didn't think of right away. So usually writing in kind of pseudocode and taking it a step at a time is the best way for me. But I know other people that literally just like to start writing code and then get it to compile and then like work like effectively introduce bugs on purpose and then go through and like fix those bugs. And by fixing those, they think of things to like add to the method and stuff like that. I know people that do that. I know people do a lot of different stuff, but my method is usually go into the method, find a global problem, then kind of break it down in classes. So I'm like, okay, these are the different classes that I need to solve this problem. Then I think about it inside the class. I go, okay, these are the different methods inside the class, so what each class needs to do, okay? Then inside of each method, I say, okay, here's the things this method has to do. And I usually write it out in just text and then go through and start filling it in, if that makes sense. So hopefully that answers your question about like, you know, how to kind of design a function or how to think about it. Again, it's very personal. Like I think each person might have a different answer to that question, but hopefully that answered your question somewhat. and feel free, again, I know I mentioned this a few times, but feel free if you want like a more personalized response or like a longer answer with like maybe some back and forth and stuff like that, feel free to send me an email at my Andro and Tech Gmail account. I will 100% respond, and we can go back and forth and stuff and really like dive deep in if you have a more specific question or something like that. Anyways, okay, so let's get back to our UI pop-up here. So we've already determined how many buttons are active, okay? So really it's set how many buttons are active. Then, excuse me. Then we need to register our callbacks. So we did that with our onButton A and onButton B. Then we need to register IDs. And then now we need to set our title text. So we already have our title text. So these are pretty simple because we already have direct references to these text elements. So we can just say set our title text to the title text that gets sent in as a parameter. And then we can keep this train rolling. So now we have content text dot text dot text equals title. Nope. See, almost did a typo. Not equals title, equals content. There we go. then, so our button text, so this one's a little more complicated because we have two buttons, obviously. So we actually, you know what we might do? We might be able to combo here. Register IDs and set button text. So we don't really need to set the text on buttons that we're not even using. You know what I mean? So let's go ahead and do this here. Also, we need access to the button text that's inside this button object. Anywho, there's button text. So let's go ahead and kind of piggyback on this loop that we're doing here. I mean, in theory, yeah, we could take this for loop and we could add another one afterwards, but that's just inefficient. There's no reason to do that. We don't need to loop through our buttons twice. So instead, we're gonna go let's hear pop-up buttons, and then what we want to do is, so we know how our buttons are set up. Now we could do this a little bit cleaner. So we could have code that sits on our button itself. And then in that code, we could have a direct reference to this text. Okay. We could do that. But instead, we know how our buttons are set up. We know our buttons are just going to be button and then text underneath it. Some would say maybe I'm getting a little lazy at this point because it's, 10 o'clock at night and I'm tired. But I don't know, I think we're safe here. So I'm going to go get component in children, and then I'm going to do that of type text. So this should return me the text component that's in the child of that said button. Okay, so this text component here. So that's the text we actually want to set to say, like, okay, what our button needs to say on it. So now that we have that, we want to go text, and then we want to set that text to our buttons. I said buttons, not button. If only Visual Studio could read my mind. And then set it to the button text. Cool. So that should fully set up, should both register the IDs and set up the button text, which is pretty nice. So at this point, our initialization is pretty much done. I don't think there's anything else we need to do at this point that I can think of inside this initialization method. Now maybe we'll start running and it won't work and there'll be something else we have to come back and revisit inside of here. But for now, I think that's pretty legit. So really the only thing else that we need to do inside of our UI pop-up is we just need to handle what we do when pop-up button A is pressed and what we do when pop-up button B is pressed. Okay? So, which is, again, pretty simple. So we're going to call button click callback. So remember, this is the callback that we pass in here, which got passed in here, which is eventually going to come from UI options. So in here, we're going to invoke this. And remember, we need to pass in the ID of the one that we did. So that's going to be A. So that's our first button. So we know pop-up button 0. Oh, nope, not pop-up button 0. Pop-up button ID is 0. Is the ID that we need to send. Remember, we set those up here inside this for loop. So same thing. So we need to call this same code. We're going to call this with button ID 1. Okay, cool. So at this point, our UI pop-ups is pretty much set. I don't know if there's anything else we need to do in here. So I think we're pretty good. So let's go back now. Let's take another step back. And let's get to Pop-Up Manager. So remember, we haven't actually done anything here. So we need to create our generic pop-up, and then we need to tell UI pop-up to initialize that. Sounds great. So what we want to do here is we want to initialize it, or instantiate it, okay? So again, in Unity, that's a pretty easy call. So that's just, if I can spell it right, instantiate, and then you pass the type that you want. So we're going to do GameObject. And then what we need to instantiate. Now, that's where it gets a little more tricky. So remember, we created this prefab here, this pop-up generic. That's the prefab that we want to instantiate. Whatever, we'll get to that in a second. So that's the pop-up that we want to instantiate. So that lives here in our resources directory. So what we need to do first is we need to load it from our resources directory. then after we load it from our resources directory, we then need to instantiate effectively a copy of it. Okay, so so what we want to do is we want to first, then we're going to let's see here. Let's start. So we're gonna load our generic pop-up prefab from resources. Oh God, I'm having trouble spelling. Okay, so what's nice is, since we're using something built into Unity, okay, we have like a nice set of methods already built in for us. So effectively, we just want to call resources.load, the type, so again, this is a game object in this case, and then the path that we need to load it at. So remember I talked about having this pop-up types. Each one of those is going to be directly tied to one of these prefabs, okay? So what we're going to do is I'm going to create another helper method here, which is going to be, actually, you know what? I don't even need to create this other method. We can just do this inline here. Since we already know we're in this pop-up type here, we can just call resources.load, and then we know, okay, it's a generic pop-up. So we know where the generic pop-up lives. Or, well, I'm going to create a constant for that. But yes, we know where that lives. So let's go. Region. So I do all my consts. I do a K in front of them. So again, this is just formatting stuff. Nothing special you have to follow. So, and then we're gonna call this what is this? This is our generic pop-up path. Generic pop-up path, and that is going to equal. So that'd be resources. So anything you load from resources, by the way, so whenever you call this resources.load, it's always relative to resources. So for us, it's going to be popups / popup _ generic. So we have popups / popup _ generic. Boom. And you don't need like an extension or anything like that. So so at this point, then we just can go _k generic pop-up path. So this should, in theory, return us a game object that is our whatever we can call this, our pop-up prefab. And then at that point, now that we've loaded that, we can then go ahead and instantiate that pop-up prefab. And what's cool about that is then we can go and grab, after we instantiate this actually returns us the thing that we instantiated. So we can go, so that's going to instantiate us, or return us what we instantiated. So that's a big distinction. So a lot of people run into this problem right away when they're working with prefabs and loading stuff from resources and instantiating things. So this pop-up prefab, this is literally like a pointer to what's in the project. So you can't actually do anything with that other than use it as a copy when you instantiate. The key is you need to make sure that when you would like get the UI pop-up code, when you call initialize, stuff like that, you're actually calling it on pop-up object, which is what's going to be returned from the instantiation call. If you try to start doing stuff with this pop-up prefab, what you directly load from resources.load, it's not going to work. You're going to get a bunch of errors. It's going to be a bunch of problems. So you got to be careful that when you're working at runtime, you're working with the stuff that's in the hierarchy, not with the stuff that's in the prefab. So that's a common mistake that I see like in my day job or like in past companies and stuff like that all the time. But anyways, so we load our generic pop from prefabs. Instantiate a copy of it. Instantiate copy of it. Okay. And then we need to, there we go, tell UI Popup to initialize. Yeah. So we can go Popup object get components UI Popup, and then we can call initialize. So again, so all this is doing is when we create a pop-up at runtime, it's going to say, okay, pop-up generic that you just created, we're going to get this component, so this UI pop-up component off of it. Then we're going to take that UI pop-up component and we're going to call the initialize method on it, which is going to be this initialize method here. So that's kind of like you're starting to see the loop, the algorithm more, like how we're going from telling the pop-up to be created to actually creating it to initializing it and everything. So, let's fill in this initialization method. 1 second. So initialize, and then so we have the string title. So remember, we already have that passed in. Content, same thing. And then we have our buttons. So really, we're just kind of passing along information here. Cool. So that looks good. So I think that's all we need to do now in this create pop-up. I think that's pretty much legit at this point, which is nice. Let's see here. So somebody asked in the comments section, so what is your day job, if you don't mind answering? So I'm a professional software engineer, so senior software engineer technically. I work at a company in San Francisco, so San Francisco, California. I work specifically on a mobile, so both iOS and Android. So it's a mobile game that effectively I work specifically on the mobile game mostly. But it's a mobile game where there is both like a physical product, then also like a mobile game with it. So effectively, you buy the physical product from like a store or Amazon or whatever, and then there is a mobile app that's like a companion app that allows you to interact with the physical product in a certain way, if that makes sense. So I work on, specifically at work, I usually work on mostly like system architecture type stuff. So things like content pipeline, build system, tools, communication between different layers of code, stuff like that. Hopefully that answered your question. If you want more details, just ask a more specific question. I wasn't sure what exactly you wanted as an answer in that. But yeah, so pretty much, yeah, what you're seeing me. So what I'm doing here is not like some of what I do like in the stream is what I'm doing in my day job. We use Unity at my day job, C# Unity, but yeah, at work I'm doing more like complex systems, if that makes sense. Like I've done like our like all of our resource, like our asset management. So like loading images off disk, well, downloading images to loading images off disk, to like memory management around those images, stuff like that. Content pipeline, so how we go from having the images from our artists to getting the images in the game, stuff around that. Tools, both tools for different engineers, different artists, different designers, stuff like that. Tools for them to help them make the game faster and better and more efficient. To also like test tools for like QA to be able to test like the code that we're writing and stuff like that. As well as writing a lot of like shared. So we have multiple projects going on at the company that both use that all use Unity. So I've wrote a lot of, or not a lot, but I've wrote a decent amount of like shared logic that's kind of shared between the different projects. So that way, like if project A solves a problem, project B doesn't also have to solve that solve that problem independently. Instead, once one solves it, you can kind of just add it to like a shared code base, and then both get the solution to that, if that makes sense. So I've done a lot of work around that kind of sharing of code between projects as well. So that's kind of what I do at work on a day-to-day basis. I don't really write UI as much as I used to, like UI code as much as I used to, or gameplay code. Our app is almost entirely UI. We have very little like gameplay elements in the actual app itself. Most of the gameplay is in the physical product. So cool. So as I answer this question, yay. So anyways, back to what I was saying. Excuse me. Oh, dying over here. So in our create pop-up method here, I believe we actually are fully good there. And I think we're fully good in our UI pop-up initialize method as well. I believe so. The only thing I think I'm going to do is in here, I'm actually going to return the game object that has been created. Just because it's nice then. Anytime you're creating something, it's nice to actually return the thing that you're creating. That way you don't get into a situation where you're creating something and you don't realize what you're creating, or you don't have access to it afterwards. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to return null way back over here. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do this instead. So I'm going to do... I'm going to return this created object, and then create var to store created object, and then in here, actually, you know what I'm going to do? Better yet, I'm just going to call this pop-up object. Yeah, there we go. And then I'm going to return pop-up object. Cool. So that way, yeah, whoever creoles, good word, creoles. Whoever creates this pop-up will, or whoever calls create pop-up will be able to then get a reference to the game object that was created. So that'll just make things easier down the road, especially when it comes to closing this pop-up, because that's something I'm going to definitely need to do. Yeah, so let's go UI options. So okay, let's go back to Unity first. Let's make sure everything compiles. So we've wrote a decent amount of code. Usually I'll go back to Unity faster than just like as frequently as we just did, but it's good to make sure all your code compiles. So obviously we're all compiled, which is great. And we should go ahead and set up our public variables here, our serialized variables in our UI pop-up code. So let's go with title. We need that. We need our content text. We need that. We need our buttons. We got button 0 and button 1. Yay. And again, anytime you're working with prefabs in Unity, hitting apply is just going to save any of the things that you did here in the hierarchy. Because remember, the prefab is serialized to disk. So hitting apply is actually doing that serialization. Well, technically it's marking it as dirty, and then it serializes when you say product, but effectively it serializes it to disk at that point. So so any of those things that we just set, notice, have been now set in the prefab, and that's important because when we instantiate this prefab, okay, we want to make sure that all those things are correctly set. Otherwise, we're going to get a bunch of null references and nothing's going to work. So that's important. That's another reason why it's important. If you're using a public a serialized variable in a prefab that you need to store a reference to, okay, like we're doing here, make sure that that thing is a child of the prefab. Because, for example, let's say I set this text over here, which is just in the hierarchy. It's not actually a child of this prefab. Let's say I set that text to one of the things in here. Well, as soon as I save it, that text is now none. And that's because the prefab knows nothing about that text, because that text doesn't exist in the prefab. So you got to make sure that any type of public or serialized reference that you do like that is stored underneath the prefab itself. Otherwise, as soon as you delete the prefab out of the hierarchy and try to load it in later, you would get no references here. So that's not good. Don't want that. So anyway, let's see here. Wait, gross. So I don't know why Pop-Up Manager had UI pop-up on it. No, UI Manager is supposed to, or Pop-Up Manager is supposed to have Pop-Up Manager code on it. I'm glad I just randomly clicked on that. Otherwise, this would not have worked. Okay, so I think the only part of the loop now that's not done is the actual UI options menu. So like I said, first thing we need to do is we need to create the pop-up itself. So we're going to go popup manager.sinstance.create popup. So remember a couple things we got to input. So what type of pop-up? So we only have generic, but luckily that's what we want to do. Then we have to do the title. So what is the title of this going to be? So what do we want this pop-up to look like? It's going to pop up. It's going to ask you if you're sure you want to, let's call it, okay. So we're going to make the title of it confirmation. Cool. And then the content is going to be, are you sure you want to, reset all your data? There is no, there's no reversing this action. Sure, that works. Okay, cool. Now, what else do we need? We need, okay, so we need the buttons, and then we need our handlers. So for the buttons right now, I'm just gonna leave that blank because we're gonna create that before we actually call this method. But then we need our button on click callback, which we have right here nicely. So we're gonna go on pop-up, on pop-up button pressed, boom. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's create our buttons. So we need to create a list of button, oh gosh, what is this? Pop-up manager dot button objects. So we need to create a list of those, and that's going to be our buttons. And we need to create two of these. So we need to create one that says yes and one that says no. So we're going to add new. Okay, and let's also go into this and let's make this a little bit easier. Instead of creating a new one and then setting these explicitly, let's create a constructor for this. So pop-up button object, where we can pass in what we want the, oh my gosh, string ID and string button text. And then let's see here, ID equals ID and button text equals button text. So this just makes it easier to create new ones of these. Otherwise, we'd have to create new, use the default constructor, and then manually set the ID and button text. But now by doing it this way, it allows us to do this like in line here. So now we have the option to say, okay, what do we want our ID to be? So our ID for this is we're going to create our, we want our no button on the left and our yes button on the right. So we're going to go no. Cool. And then that's our ID. And then our button text is going to be no. See? Pretty simple. So now we just need to create the same thing. So we're going to create yes and yes. So creating a button's not so bad. And then down here already, so remember, this is the code that's going to be called when our buttons are pressed. So I'm going to go ahead and set these up real quick with what our IDs are here. So that way I remember how this works. So we have no. And then we have yes. So I could probably make like constants for these or member variables or something, but we're just gonna work in a magic land right now. Again, because by 11 I wanna get this working before the stream ends tonight. So I'm working at maybe a little bit faster pace than I normally would. But that's fair. I mean, sometimes you got to do that. So let's see here. So buttons. No, I said buttons. I'm really surprised at how long this pop-up manager is taking. See, that's the sneaky thing about programming is like certain things will seem much more difficult than they actually are, and then vice versa. Like pop-up manager, oh, I'm just making a pop-up. That's going to take 2 seconds. Well, we've been working on it for 2.5 hours now. So, yay. Well, I guess reset data took about 10 minutes or so. But yeah. So, anyways, so what do we want to do when you hit no? And what do we want to do when you hit yes? Well, no matter what, we want to close the pop-up, okay? So remember, when we call create pop-up here, we get a reference, luckily, to the pop-up. So what we can do is we can make a member variable here. So we can go private pop-up, no, private GameObject, and that's going to be our pop-up. And then we can set this. So that's why I knew that we needed to return inside of our create pop-up. We wanted to make sure we returned a reference to the game object, mainly due to the fact that when we hit either of our buttons, we want to close it. Now, it's a pop-up. We probably could say, you know what? All right, this is a good point. This is a very good point. So I'm just going to, I'm actually going to go back in our UI pop-up. So we know in our UI pop-up, we know that we want to close the pop-up no matter what every time we press a button. Because it's always going to be like a yes or no question or something similar to that, or like an okay. So we're just going to go ahead and close it here. So we're going to go GameObject.setActive false. Actually, we don't even want to do that. Since this is something we created through Instantiate, and we don't want to be on screen anymore, because if we show it again, it's going to be a brand new one created. So we actually want to destroy this, which is a little bit different than setting active. So setting active and not is just straight up what you see now. So it still lives in the higher. Oh my fucking god. Okay. All right. I just need to kill EVGA precision, so that way it stops doing this. Thank you. Anyways, so this is setting active. So yeah, it doesn't show on the screen anymore, but it still lives in memory and it still lives in the hierarchy. Destroying is straight up deleting something from the hierarchy and from memory. So so that's actually what we want to do here. So we want to go ahead and destroy this when we hit either of our buttons. And this is actual logic that I'm putting in UI pop-up. What's nice about that though is UI options then doesn't need to like worry about killing it. Like it kills itself, and that's what I like to do. Is I like to kill it. Oh Jesus. It closes itself. Sure, it destroys itself. But effectively, the reason I do that is I like to have each individual element maintain themselves if possible. Like I like to have more passive managers than active managers, if that makes sense. So the global managers are very passive. They kind of create stuff, give it jobs, tell it to do things. But the actual kind of destroying of itself and maintaining its own state, that is done at the component level itself. So we don't need this anymore. Go away. Go away. Cool. So if we hit no, what do? We do nothing. So technically, we don't even actually care about that. When we hit no, we do absolutely nothing. Because if they said no, we're going to close the pop-up and they're just going to go... yeah, it kills itself. It does kill itself and all of its children. That is 100% true. That is what it does, which sounds very, very, very bad out of context. But anyways, back to the old programming. So yes is what we care about. We just care if you hit yes. So if you hit yes, we want to do what we were doing previous, which is we want to call reset game. And we want to reinitialize our sliders. If it doesn't call yes, that just means we hit this method, we check if it was yes. If it's not yes, we do nothing. So super easy. So yeah, so at this point, I think it should just work. So let's do a quick kind of mental rundown. Well, first let's see if it compiles. Hopefully it compiles. Yeah, it compiled. Okay, so let's do a quick little rundown of what's going to happen. So inside of UI options, when you hit the reset button, it should come in here, create the buttons that you need. So you're going to have a yes button and a no button. It should then create the pop-up, a generic type pop-up. The title is going to be confirmation. It's going to say, are you sure you want to reset all your data? I'm going to make it a question mark. There's no reversing this action. It's going to pass in the buttons, and it's going to pass in this callback. Okay. When that is called, the pop-up should create itself. Okay, so we should initialize it or load it from the resources here. We should instantiate a copy of that prefab that we loaded. We should then call initialize on the code that's on that prefab, where we pass in all the stuff that we just had access to. And here we should set what buttons are active, set up the listeners for those buttons, set up the IDs for those buttons, set the text on those buttons, set up the title, set up the content, store a callback. Okay, so this all looks good to me. I think this looks good. I like everything that's here. Let's see if there's anything else that looks like it needs to have happen. Okay, so that's going to call the callback with the ID, and it's going to destroy itself. UI options, so we get back in here, we should get the ID yes. Remember, that's the ID we're setting up here, right there. And then initialize. Okay, all right, screw it. Time to try it, see what happens. Okay, so we're going to hit play. Cool, so we're going to hit options, reset all data. So in theory, as soon as I press this, in theory, so everything's always in theory in life. In theory, Popup generic should be created. Oh, here's the sneaky one. So this will be created. I know this is not going to work. I can tell you it's already not going to work. So when this is created in our, let's see, our create method, here's the problem. We're instantiating this pop-up object, but where are we putting it? We're not putting it anywhere. It's just living aimlessly in freaking nowhere land. It's going to be created, and it's just going to live. Let's go to our, let's go to our menu. Oops. It's just going to live here, out in the root of the hierarchy. What we need to do is we need to put it underneath our canvas, okay, our root canvas. So there's a couple different ways to do this. Luckily, we know that our canvas is named canvas root, so we're just going to go ahead and we're going to do it the, okay, let's do it a better way. So we're going to do it a better way. We're actually going to look in our scene. So we know we only have one canvas in our scene. That's a requirement or a rule that we've already made at this point. I guess a decision. So we have one canvas. We know we only have one canvas. So what we're going to do is we're just going to look at this point. We're going to find the root canvas. So we're going to go GameObject.find. Oh, actually, we're going to go transform. And I'm going to explain why we're going to do this in a second. So find object of type, which is here. And we're going to find of type canvas. So what this is going to do is it's going to search through our hierarchy, and it's going to return the first thing it finds that has the type canvas on it, okay? Which is going to be, in our case, our root canvas, since that's the only canvas that we have in the scene. So what we want to do is we actually want to set our pop-up object, okay? Let's see here, set parent. Wait, so we want to set parent. So we want to find our root canvas, and we want to tell our pop-up object that we want it to be a child of that root canvas. Okay. So what's nice about that is, and then false. So what's wrong here? Oh, okay, because I need to go transform. There we go. I thought that would return transform. Yeah, it's fine. Do I not need this? I just do find object of type. Huh, apparently that's a static method I can just call. Okay, never mind. Okay, so effectively what I'm doing is I'm finding the root canvas and setting it as parent of our pop-up object. So the reason I'm doing that is because, remember, as I mentioned when I first started talking about the Unity UI, is that Unity UI elements all have to live under a canvas. So if I create this pop-up generic and just throw it in the root of our hierarchy, it's not going to work, and it needs to live underneath of the root canvas. So that's the first thing I'm doing. Number two, notice I passed false here. So that's really important. The reason is because otherwise what's going to happen is these values here are all set to be local values, so local to this object underneath root canvas. So what would end up happening is if I drag this here out into the thing, so number one, notice it doesn't show, like it doesn't work because it's not underneath the root, underneath a canvas. Also notice that when I drag underneath here, it's all stretched and has weird values in here. And that's because it actually took the world values and kept them when I dragged them in and effectively did a conversion onto what the value should be based on what its parents are. So what we're saying is hey, just ignore that. Instead, keep these values, which there's a lot of them. Let me get down here. One. So keep those values. So instead, look like this. So that's what that false does. So that no, don't want to do that. Swing and a miss. So that false is actually a very nice little helper thing that Unity added at one point after, because you previously what you would have to do is you would create the object, you would set its parent, and then you would have to go through all of those values and reset them to what they were in the prefab. It was really annoying. Luckily, Unity at one point was like, oh, okay, we can just add a helper to do that. Which was glorious. I'm very happy that they did that. So anyways, so that's the first thing we need to do is we need to set the canvas root as its parent. The second thing we need to do is after we do that, we need to make sure that the pop-up object is sorted on top. So remember, as I talked about earlier in this stream, the way Unity does sorting in terms of its UI is it's based on the hierarchy position. So the lower you are in the hierarchy, the higher your sort order, like the most, you'll always be on top, if that makes sense. So it draws things in order that they are in the hierarchy. So this is drawn first, this is drawn second, this is drawn third. So our pop-up, we always want to be drawn last. So that way it always shows in front of everything else because it's a pop-up. So what we need to do is we need to make sure it becomes the last position in our hierarchy. So what's nice is there's also another built-in method for this. So if we go popup.transform, we can set as last sibling. So that's nice. So effectively that allows us to say, okay, inside between me and my other children, make sure that I am the last sibling in the list. So that should make sure the pop-up is the last thing here underneath the root canvas. Therefore, it'll make sure it's displayed on top. So, but anyways, okay. So at this point, I believe now we can actually test this and it should work. Otherwise, it wasn't going to work before because it was just going to spawn it out here just in the middle of nowhere and nothing was going to happen. So let's go to options and let's hit reset all data and let's hope it works. Because if it doesn't, then I'm going to feel stupid. But hey, our pop-up worked. All right, so you notice our pop-up is created. It gets put underneath our root canvas. It gets put as the last thing in the root canvas. And we know it's instantiated because it has this clone. So Unity by default always adds this clone suffix to any object that you create from instantiate. So what's cool is our title, confirmation, okay? Are you sure you want to reset all your data? There's no reverse action, so we need a space in our text here. So I can go ahead and add that before I forget. So yeah, we just need a space here. So we have a yes, we have a no. So I got an error right there because I changed the code while we were running. So I'm just gonna pop back out and pop back in there. So yeah, so let's hit no. Hopefully that didn't actually do anything, but let's go ahead and let's change our data around. So let's go back. So remember it's set to that. We can go back and view that. Okay, so it's still set to that, and we can even confirm that by going to our save game file. So remember, this is the file on disk that we're actually saving the game with. And see, so we're set to 0.1 and 0.93, 0.11, 0.93. Okay, so that's what we're set to currently. Now let's hit reset. Let's hit no. Okay, hit no. The thing closes, and let's confirm. Let's go back to our save game, and let's make sure that we're still set to that. Okay, we're still set to 11.93. Okay, we can also confirm that by going back in and back out. See, it's still set to those values. Great. Now let's for the kitchen sink here. Let's hit yes, and let's see what happens. Hopefully it resets our data. So we'll notice immediately if it works. If I hit yes, and the progress bars, remember, so they're at like 10% and 90%. If those both jump to 0.75, which is 75%, which is our default. So let's hit yes. Boom. It works. So we can even see down here that it saved a new file when we did that. Excuse me. Let's go in here. Let's check our save game. I'm pretty confident it's going to say 0.75, 0.75. It does. So you can see, so yeah, this pop-up is totally working. So what's really nice is now that we've created this, at any time, we can make that pop-up show. So let's just let's show using it at a different point. So let's go into our main menu because I want to test. So effectively at this point, it seems to be working, yes. But one thing we didn't test out, we didn't test showing one button instead of two buttons. So I want to try showing one button and seeing if it still works. So when we hit play game, instead of switching to the select game screen, okay, I'm going to comment that out. And instead, I'm going to create a new pop-up here, okay? So I'm going to create, let's see here. Let's go pop-up manager dot buttons pop-up object. Oh, yeah, remember, so first thing I want to do is I want to create a list of these. Buttons. And then, so we're going to make our ID, it doesn't really matter what we're going to make our ID because I'm just going to make it an OK. So effectively, it's just going to close itself, and that's all it's going to matter. But, okay, and then, this is a good point. So I want to create just a generic OK pop-up here. So this kind of changes the way that I'm using the create pop-up method. So let's see here. So pop-up, so we're going to do generic. We're going to go title is going to be, so I want title to be nothing, which is fine. That should work fine. Let's see here. This menu option, no, I don't know what I'm doing. No, this menu option is not set up yet. Boom. Okay. And then buttons, which I've already created buttons. And then, so this is the part where I know I'm going to need to change some things to make it work. So for our callback, I'm actually passing null, okay? Which isn't a big deal, except for the fact that in, let's see here, UI pop-up, we're actually just straight calling this callback. But as long as I switch this and say if button callback does not equal null, then that allows us instead to pass null if we want. Like in this case, when OK is hit, all I want to have happen is I want the pop-up to close. That's it. But instead of needing to manually pass in a callback and then close it myself, since it's already being destroyed here, I don't really care what it's being set to, because I don't need to know that information later on when I get it. So instead, I can just pass null here, and what that does is that allows me to say, okay, I don't care what happens when the button is pressed. Just close it yourself. So by adding that check here in UI pop-up, it allows me to handle the case when I pass null. So yeah, so in theory, what should happen is when we hit the play game button, we should get a new pop-up. The pop-up should have no title. It should say this menu option is not set up yet, okay, because it isn't, which is great. And then we should have a button that says okay, but we should only have one button and it should be in the center. So remember our previous pop-up, we had two buttons next to each other that said yes and no. So this is my point of how, if this works, hopefully this works, this is proving my concept of having like one pop-up object that I can dynamically use across the app, which, you know, seemed like a lot of work, like 2.5 hours to build this. But if I can use it every single time I need a pop-up, then it makes my life so much easier because I don't have to keep rewriting code. Instead, I wrote one thing that's generic across a lot. So remember, let's go to options, hit reset all that. So remember, okay, so we have our confirmation, we have the text, yes and no. Okay, so I'm gonna hit no, I'm gonna go back. So now when we hit play game, it should in theory be using the same prefab, but be dynamically set up different to use just one button. Boom, there it is. So remember, no title. It just says this menu option is not set up yet, and we have an OK button. I don't care what happens. Like, I don't need to know in my main menu code what happens when I hit OK. I just need to close. Boom, it closes. So see how I can use the same prefab in two different places and just have code that dynamically changes it based on what you need it to do and say. And now how, a small chunk of work has now saved me a ton of work down the road. So I'm actually very happy about this. I'm glad we got this working, especially since it's 10:49 and I had 10 minutes. I was running it close on that one. But yeah, so I know I've been saying this for like freaking ever, that we were gonna handle the play mode, the select game. I promise we're doing that next week, because that's exactly what the next thing. I can't believe. So it's pretty crazy to think about. Is it's been so excuse me. This is the fourth stream, so roughly 3 hours each. So that's 12 hours total. I would say the main menu has taken easily 8 hours of that 12 hours. Like, UI, man. UI is like a sneaky thing how long it takes. Sneaky. So anyways, so we have about 10 minutes left. At this point, like at the end of every stream, I like to just reach out to the chat. Anybody that's there that wants to answer a question, go ahead. That wants to ask a question, go ahead. I will answer it the best I can. I know people like to talk or ask questions like during it, but some people don't want to interrupt, or don't know like that they can ask questions or whatever. Excuse me. So yeah. So if anybody has any questions, let me know. You can please type them in the chat at this moment. It doesn't have to. Excuse me. Doesn't have to be specific to this video game. Can be a generic question about video games, or how to work in video games, or what computer to use for video games, or I don't know what condiments I like on my burger. I don't care. Whatever, anything anybody would like to ask right now, feel free. Go ahead. If nobody has any questions, gosh, dying. If nobody has any questions, I can. I'll just sign off. I'll definitely put this stream up on YouTube, on my YouTube channel. All the streams are archived. Man. All the streams are archived on my YouTube channel. In case you miss it, or missed the beginning, or missed a previous stream, or whatever. Man. Excuse me. So yeah, so same time next week. If you have any questions, if you don't feel like typing in chat, you can always email me. I'll always try to respond within a day or two. I've gotten a few emails after each show, so I just want to keep reiterating that if anybody likes to email me, shoot me some emails, and I'll definitely respond to those. Those are a little bit easier to do more specific answers to sometimes. Let's see here. Yeah, so also, like, anybody that's watching, feel free to share this stream as much as humanly possible. I really want to help people. I think a really cool thing about Twitch can be the social interaction between, like, the chat and me, and then just, other people in the chat going back and forth and stuff. I want to get a large user base watching. I figured if we can get like 100 people or something like that, the most I've seen at one time has been like 40. If we can get like 100 people watching, that'd be amazing. I think there could be some really cool like inter-chat excuse me, communication between people and stuff, talking about different game dev stuff. Yeah, so yeah, feel free to share it. Yeah, that'd be cool. I've been trying to post like Reddit a lot. Reddit seems to be a good source of people in game dev and stuff like that. So feel free to share it. But yeah. So it doesn't look like anybody is asking any questions. So give it another minute or so, and then I think at 10:55 I will sign off on this. And yeah, like I said, I'll upload this to YouTube immediately after. Timestamps usually take me like a day or two, maybe 3, maybe 4, to get the timestamps up there. It's so funny. It's like a 20-minute process that like I feel like I just never have time to do, because it's like I go back to work tomorrow, and then I'm busy at my day job, like, and then it's usually like Friday when I finally have time to do it again. But anyways, yeah. So I'll put this up on YouTube. I'll get the timestamps up there in a couple days. So yeah, so looks like nobody has any questions. So looks like I will end this puppy. Thanks again for watching, everybody. I wasn't sure if anybody was gonna care, so I like that people are watching. It gives me motivation to keep doing it. Hopefully you guys learned something. Maybe it'd be something bad, but as long as you're learning something, it's good. So yeah, so again, thanks for watching. Catch you guys next week.